My name is Nia, and at 32 years old, I sat in a freezing mahogany paneled office in downtown Atlanta, surrounded by 15 relatives who wanted to see me destroyed. At the head of the polished table, my mother Valerie laughed a cold, bitter sound that echoed off the walls. Your father wanted nothing to do with you, she announced to the room. He hated you for 10 solid years. The seasoned lawyer, Mr. Sterling, silently opened a sealed brown envelope stamped with my late father's name. He read the first line, his expression completely unreadable, and then pushed it across the heavy table toward me. I said absolutely nothing. I just stared at the messy handwriting I had not seen in a decade. My uncle Roland, who had not spoken a single word to me in 13 years, leaned forward and whispered in my ear, "Open it, but do not open it in front of her." Before I tell you what was inside that envelope and how it gave me the power to send my own family to federal prison, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family that tried to break you. The atmosphere inside the law firm was suffocating. Outside, a heavy Georgia rainstorm battered the glass, but inside, the tension was even more violent. I had flown down from New York, dreading this exact moment. I work as a forensic accountant, a career built entirely on finding hidden truths in complex data. But nothing could have prepared me for the sheer hostility radiating from my own blood relatives. 15 pairs of eyes locked onto me as if I were a stranger who had just crashed a private funeral. Aunts, uncles, and cousins sat rigidly in leather chairs, whispering to each other and shaking their heads in synchronized judgment. They had all been summoned for the reading of my father's will, and my mother had clearly spent the morning poisoning them against me. Valerie. My 58-year-old mother sat like a queen on her throne at the head of the table. She was the matriarch of her local church community, a woman who spent every Sunday smiling in the front pew while wearing extravagant hats. Today, she wore a tailored black dress perfectly made up to look like a grieving widow, but her dark eyes were sharp, calculating, and empty of genuine sorrow. She had always used her status in the church to manipulate the family and command absolute obedience. For years, she had successfully painted herself as a long-suffering martyr while silently controlling every single dollar my father ever earned. Sitting directly beside my mother was my younger sister Tasha, the undeniable golden child of our family. At 29 years old, Tasha had perfected the art of playing the fragile, helpless victim, seeking constant sympathy from our aunts. Next to her sat her husband, DeAndre. DeAndre was 32, a loud, flashy cryptocurrency investor who practically lived on social media. He was wearing a custom suit that was visibly too tight across his shoulders and a massive gold watch. DeAndre constantly bragged about his massive investments online, but always seemed to need an emergency cash loan behind closed doors. He sat loudly tapping an expensive pen against the wood table and staring down his nose at me with pure disdain. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, attempting to bring the chaotic room to order. He was a distinguished African-American man who had been a close friend to my father before the dementia took over. Before we proceed with the formal reading of the estate, he began, his voice gravelly and deeply serious. There is a matter of a sealed brown envelope left specifically for Nia. The moment he pushed that thick envelope toward me, the entire room erupted in angry murmurs. That was when my mother slammed her manicured hand flat against the table, demanding immediate silence. "Do not even bother touching that envelope," she snapped, her voice dripping with venom. "Your father wanted absolutely nothing to do with you, Nia. He only left that note to tell you exactly what a massive disappointment you are from beyond the grave. Just look at her." Valerie continued, gesturing toward me. She completely abandoned her sick father. She left us here to deal with his terrible illness while she ran off to live her bougie, arrogant lifestyle in New York City. And now she has the absolute nerve to show up here today expecting a massive handout from his estate. Tasha crossed her arms and sneered loudly, dropping her fragile victim act. "You are truly unbelievable, Nia," she said. "You did not even bother to come visit him when his memory started fading away. We were the ones who suffered day and night. We took care of everything. And DeAndre had to step up and handle all of Dad's complex business affairs because you were way too busy playing successful corporate executive up north." I kept my face completely blank, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me react. My heart was pounding fiercely, but years of interrogating hostile executives in my accounting career had taught me how to keep my emotions locked away. I remembered the actual undeniable truth of what happened 10 years ago. I did not abandon my father. Valerie had packed my bags in the middle of the night and kicked me out of the house because I refused to hand over my college savings to pay off one of DeAndre's early failed business ventures. She had spent the next decade intentionally intercepting my phone calls, returning my letters unopened, and telling our entire church congregation that I had selfishly disowned them. DeAndre suddenly leaned forward, stopping his annoying pen tapping. He reached into his designer leather folder and slid a crisp white legal document across the table, intentionally sliding it right on top of the brown envelope my father had left for me. "Let us just cut the nonsense right now," DeAndre said, his tone incredibly arrogant. "Your father made a massive financial mess before he passed away. He left behind a totally bankrupt company called Oakwood Holdings. It is completely underwater, drowning in high-interest debt and massive unpaid taxes. Since you are technically his eldest daughter, your name is automatically tied to the estate. If you do not sign this waiver of inheritance right now, Oakwood Holdings is going to drag you down with it. It will absolutely ruin your pristine corporate credit score and cost you your corporate job." I looked down at the waiver of inheritance. The document was dense with confusing legal jargon. By signing it, I would permanently surrender any and all rights to my father's estate and walk away with absolutely nothing. Something felt deeply and fundamentally wrong. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly how to spot a major glitch in a financial system. A grifter like DeAndre did not generously volunteer to absorb a bankrupt company out of the goodness of his heart. He only made a move when there was massive money on the table. He wanted me out of the picture permanently, and he was using fear to force my hand. I reached out to pull my father's envelope out from under the legal waiver. DeAndre's heavy hand shot across the table, digging his thick fingers into the paper to pin it down. "Do not waste our time," he growled, stepping out of his chair and leaning over the wood surface. "Sign the paper right now." Suddenly, a large, calloused hand clamped down firmly on DeAndre's wrist. It was Uncle Roland. He had been sitting quietly in the far corner, completely ignored by the family. He wore a faded denim jacket that stood out sharply against the sea of expensive funeral clothes. "Let go of the girl's letter, DeAndre." Uncle Roland commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that demanded absolute respect. DeAndre swallowed hard, his arrogant smirk instantly faltering. He slowly lifted his hand off the envelope, stepping back in surprise. Uncle Roland leaned forward over the table, bringing his face close to mine. I braced myself for another insult, but instead he looked deep into my eyes and whispered his warning to open it in private. I stood up, pushing my heavy leather chair back. The sound scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. I picked up my purse and held the thick brown envelope tightly against my chest. "I need to use the restroom," I announced, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of fear. "I will return in a moment." "You are not leaving this room until you sign that document," Nia, my mother, yelled violently, slamming her hand on the table one more time. "Watch me," I replied softly but firmly. I turned my back on the 15 people who shared my blood, but actively wished for my absolute downfall. I walked out of the mahogany-paneled conference room, my heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. I felt their hateful, intense glares burning into my back with every single step I took. I stepped out into the quiet hallway, pulling the heavy oak door securely shut behind me, completely cutting off the sound of my mother's angry, demanding shouts. The silence of the corridor was a massive relief, but I knew the real battle was only just beginning. I walked straight toward the restroom, holding my breath, ready to break the seal and uncover exactly what my family was so terrified of me seeing. The restroom was freezing cold, with harsh fluorescent lights reflecting off the white subway tiles. I locked the heavy wooden door behind me and leaned against the cold porcelain sink, staring at my reflection for a brief second before looking down at the brown envelope. The thick red wax seal felt brittle under my thumb. I took a deep breath and broke it open. I reached inside, fully expecting to pull out a formally typed legal document filled with Mr. Sterling's precise legal jargon. Instead, my fingers brushed against a single folded piece of lined notebook paper and a small, stiff index card. I pulled them out. The index card had a sequence of 6 numbers printed on it alongside the faded blue logo for First Atlanta Bank. It was a safe deposit box number. I carefully unfolded the notebook paper. The handwriting was incredibly shaky, the letters uneven and poorly formed. It was the undeniable handwriting of a man whose motor skills were rapidly deteriorating from dementia. But the message itself was crystal clear and perfectly coherent. It was dated exactly 2 years ago. Nia, I am sorry. Your mother blocked all your letters. I am trapped, but I am not blind. Look into Oakwood Holdings. I read the words 3 times over. My chest tightened painfully as a massive wave of realization washed over me. For 10 long years, Valerie had sworn up and down that my father refused to read any of my letters. She had told everyone in our extended family and our church that he hated me and wanted me completely out of his life. But this hidden note proved that everything she said was a carefully constructed, malicious lie. He knew I was writing to him. She had been secretly intercepting my mail, keeping him completely isolated from the outside world. He was a literal prisoner in his own home, surrounded by greedy vultures pretending to be his loving caretakers. But the final sentence was what truly caught my attention. Look into Oakwood Holdings. My forensic accountant brain instantly shifted into high gear. DeAndre had just spent the last 10 minutes aggressively trying to convince me that Oakwood Holdings was a dead end, a completely bankrupt company drowning in toxic debt that I needed to run away from immediately. He wanted me to blindly sign away my legal rights to it without asking a single question. But my father, who spent his entire life building a modest but highly solid financial foundation, had used his brief window of mental clarity to secretly point me directly toward that exact same company. In the high-stakes world of corporate financial fraud, when someone is desperate for you to look away from a specific asset, it is always because that asset holds the absolute key to the entire scam. In my line of work, we call this a distraction tactic. They point you toward a blazing fire in one room, so you do not notice them quietly emptying the vault in the other. Oakwood Holdings was not a liability at all. It was the absolute center of whatever massive grift DeAndre and my mother were running, and my father had just handed me the shovel to dig up their dirty secrets. I carefully folded the handwritten note and the bank index card, tucking them deep inside the hidden zippered compartment of my purse. I splashed freezing cold water on my wrists, dried my hands with a paper towel, and completely erased any trace of emotion from my face. I unlocked the restroom door and walked back down the quiet hallway toward the conference room. When I pushed the heavy oak doors open, the room went dead silent once again. Everyone was seated exactly where I had left them. DeAndre was leaning forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany table, spinning his expensive gold pen between his fingers. He looked incredibly smug, fully expecting me to walk back in entirely defeated and ready to surrender to their demands. My mother had her arms tightly crossed, wearing a sickening look of triumphant superiority. I walked back to my chair at the far end of the long table, but I did not sit down. I simply picked up my leather briefcase and slung my purse over my shoulder. "Well," DeAndre said loudly, pushing the white legal document across the wood toward my empty chair. "Did you read his final insults? Let us wrap this up, Nia. We all have places to be, and you have a flight back to New York to catch. Sign the waiver right here on the dotted line." I looked directly at DeAndre. My voice was calm, even and entirely devoid of the panic he was so desperately hoping to see. "I will not be signing that document today," I said. The smug, arrogant smile instantly vanished from DeAndre's face. Tasha gasped loudly, dramatically, bringing her manicured hand to her chest. My mother's eyes narrowed into angry dark slits. "What do you mean you are not signing it?" DeAndre demanded, his voice rising sharply in volume. "We just explained this entire situation to you. You are legally tying yourself to a massive mountain of toxic debt. Are you stupid or just stubborn?" "I am a professional forensic accountant, DeAndre," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly measured and professional. "I do not sign binding financial waivers regarding corporate entities I have not personally audited." If Oakwood Holdings is truly bankrupt as you claim, then waiting a few business days for my legal team to verify the paperwork should not be a problem for you at all. That was the exact moment DeAndre completely lost his mind. He violently shoved his heavy leather chair back so hard it crashed loudly into the wood-paneled wall behind him. He marched quickly around the long conference table, completely ignoring Mr. Sterling's loud professional protests. DeAndre stepped right into my personal space looming over me, trying to use his height and physical presence to heavily intimidate me. I could smell the cheap, strong cologne radiating off his extremely tight suit. "Listen to me very carefully, you arrogant bitch!" DeAndre hissed, his face just inches from mine. "You think you can just march down here from New York and act like you run things. You do not know anything about what has been going on here. I have been holding this entire family financially together for years. I have videos, Naya. I have ring camera footage and audio recordings of your father crying for help while you were off living your fancy corporate life. I did not blink. I did not take a single step back. If you do not sign that paper right now, I am going to completely destroy your little career." DeAndre threatened angrily, jabbing his thick finger toward my face. "I know exactly who the managing partners are at your fancy accounting firm. I will call them tomorrow morning. I will send them every piece of fabricated evidence I have, and I will launch a massive social media smear campaign painting you as a monster, entirely guilty of severe elder abuse. I will tell the whole corporate world you abandoned a dying man. Your prestigious clients will drop you instantly. You will be fired, investigated, and permanently ruined." Tasha immediately jumped in, perfectly playing her role as the righteous, helpless victim. "You are so incredibly selfish, Nia," Tasha cried, fake tears pooling in her eyes. "DeAndre is trying to save us from absolute financial ruin, and you are just trying to punish us because you are bitter and jealous. You always hated that Dad loved us more than you. Just sign the paper and leave us alone." Valerie stood up aggressively, pointing her finger at me from across the room. "You are deliberately trying to destroy your sister's future," Valerie yelled, her voice echoing loudly off the mahogany walls. "You are a spiteful, hateful girl. If you walk out of this room without signing that paper, you are a complete disgrace to this family. I will make sure every single person in our Atlanta community knows exactly what kind of monster you truly are." They were throwing absolutely everything they had at me: intimidation, guilt, manipulation, and outright extortion. They wanted me to break down crying, to apologize, to beg for their forgiveness, and to frantically sign the waiver just to make the screaming stop. Instead, I simply adjusted the strap of my purse on my shoulder. I looked DeAndre dead in the eyes, completely unbothered by his aggressive posturing and desperate threats. "I need 3 business days for my personal legal counsel to review this entire estate," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, professional absolute zero. "Do not contact my phone. Direct all future communications straight to my attorney." I turned to Mr. Sterling, who was watching the entire exchange with a look of silent professional approval. "Please ensure no assets are moved, liquidated, or altered until my forensic team completes a full, comprehensive review," I instructed him. Valerie let out a piercing, dramatic shriek. "You are a disgrace," she screamed, slamming both of her fists onto the polished table. "You are dead to me, Nia. Dead." DeAndre raised his heavy hand, looking like he was actually going to grab my arm to physically stop me from leaving the room. Before his fingers could even brush the fabric of my jacket, a massive figure stepped squarely between us. Uncle Roland had crossed the room in total silence. He stood directly in front of DeAndre, towering over the younger man by several inches. Uncle Roland did not raise his voice, but the pure raw authority radiating from him made DeAndre immediately freeze in his tracks. "Step back," son Uncle Roland said quietly, "or you and I are going to have a very serious physical problem right here in this office." DeAndre swallowed hard, stepping away quickly and looking down at the floor. He knew much better than to test a man like Uncle Roland. Uncle Roland turned to me. His expression was completely serious, but his eyes held a glimmer of profound respect. "Come on, Nia," he said gently, placing a protective hand on my shoulder. "I will walk you to your car. Let them sit in here and yell at the walls." I nodded once. We walked out of the conference room together, leaving the toxic chaos of my mother's screaming and Tasha's fake crying completely behind us. We stepped into the quiet elevator and rode it down to the lobby in total silence. When the glass doors opened, we walked out into the pouring Atlanta rain, heading straight toward the parking lot. The storm outside was intense, but for the very first time in 10 years, my mind was completely and utterly clear. I had the key, I had the clue, and I was about to tear their entire fraudulent empire straight to the ground. We reached Uncle Roland's rusted Ford pickup truck. I climbed into the passenger seat shivering as the damp chill sank into my bones. The interior smelled faintly of peppermint and old leather. Uncle Roland slammed his door shut and started the engine. The wipers scraped across the windshield, pushing away the heavy rain. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, staring straight ahead at the law firm. For 13 years, we had existed in total silence. He taught me to ride a bike and helped with homework. But then the sudden freezing out happened. Valerie told me he was a violent alcoholic, forcing my father to cut ties. He let out a long, heavy sigh. "You grew up strong, Nia," he said. "Your father would be proud today. He hated what they did to you." I looked at him. Why did he let it happen? I asked, my pain surfacing. Why did he let Valerie kick me out, and why did you disappear? He looked at me, his eyes filled with profound sadness. "I never disappeared, Nia," he replied. "I was systematically banished. 13 years ago, I came to help your father with his taxes. That was when I caught your mother red-handed. She was actively siphoning cash from his retirement accounts and moving it into an offshore trust. You caught her stealing?" I asked. "Yes," he nodded. "I confronted her and threatened to tell your father." The next Sunday, Valerie told the entire church congregation I succumbed to drug addiction and tried to extort money to feed my habit. She weaponized the church against me, Nia. She told your father I was stealing from his business. She changed the locks and made sure any contact looked like harassment. I sat in stunned silence. She destroyed his reputation to cover up crimes. 10 years ago, she did the same to me, isolating my father from anyone who could protect him. "Where to Uncle Roland?" asked, shifting the truck into drive. "First Atlanta Bank." I told him, pulling the index card out of my purse. "We have a safe deposit box to open." We drove through downtown Atlanta in silence. My mind raced, piecing together her deception. Her financial abuse was a calculated operation. When my father's dementia started setting in, she had the perfect opportunity to accelerate her theft without oversight. The grand marble columns of First Atlanta Bank loomed ahead through the rain. Uncle Roland parked near the entrance, and we walked briskly through the double-glass doors. The interior was hushed and climate-controlled, a stark contrast to the chaotic storm outside and the emotional war zone we left behind at the law firm. I approached the customer service desk, pulling out my driver's license and the index card. "I am here to access a safe deposit box," I told the bank manager. The manager typed my information into his computer. "Let me verify the access credentials," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Ah, yes. Box number 8429. Your father added you as the primary authorized user exactly 2 years ago, right before his health took a major downward turn. He explicitly mandated that this box could only be opened by you personally." He led Uncle Roland and me down a short, carpeted hallway toward the heavy steel vault. The vault door was massive, an intimidating circle of polished metal and complex locking mechanisms. We stepped inside this brightly lit room filled with thousands of small rectangular metal doors. The manager inserted his master key into the corresponding slot for box 8429. I typed the 6-digit code from my father's index card into the keypad mounted below the lock. A sharp mechanical click echoed loudly in the vault. The manager stepped back, giving us absolute privacy, as I pulled the long metal drawer out of the wall and carried it over to a private viewing table in the corner of the room. My hands were entirely steady now. The initial shock had completely worn off, leaving behind nothing but the cold, hard focus of a trained investigator. I lifted the hinged metal lid. Inside there was no jewelry, no hidden cash, and no formal legal documents. Instead, the box was crammed to the brim with dozens of cheap spiral-bound notebooks, crumpled bank statements, and loose receipts. It looked like a chaotic pile of absolute garbage to the untrained eye. But I was not an untrained eye. I am a forensic accountant. I reached into the metal box and pulled out the first spiral notebook. The cover was worn and faded. I flipped it open. The pages were covered in my father's deteriorating handwriting. Some entries were violently crossed out. Others were written in shaky margins, but the core data was there. These were not diaries. They were detailed financial ledgers. My father had been quietly tracking every single dollar that moved through his accounts during the brief, fleeting moments of clarity he experienced between his severe bouts of dementia. Uncle Roland stood behind my shoulder looking down at the messy pages, with a deep frown. "What is all of this, Nia?" he asked quietly. "It looks like he was just scribbling random numbers." I pulled out a thick stack of bank statements from the bottom of the box and laid them flat on the viewing table. I cross-referenced the dates on the official bank documents with the handwritten dates in my father's messy ledgers. "No, Uncle Roland," I whispered, my eyes scanning the columns of numbers at lightning speed. "This is not random at all. This is a shadow ledger." He was secretly auditing his own estate. I flipped to a page dated 18 months ago. My father had circled a withdrawal of $50,000 in bright red ink. Beside it, he had written the word Oakwood, followed by DeAndre's initials. I quickly found the corresponding official bank statement. Sure enough, there was a wire transfer of $50,000 to a limited liability company called Oakwood Holdings. I grabbed another notebook, digging furiously into the timeline. 6 months later, another withdrawal. $100,000. The note beside it read, "Church Land Property Tax Emergency." But the official bank statement showed the money was routed directly to a cryptocurrency exchange platform registered entirely in DeAndre's name. My heart began to beat with a steady rhythm of absolute fury. The numbers were jumping off the page, assembling a horrifying puzzle in my mind. In my daily corporate work, I deal with sophisticated embezzlers, hiding money behind complex corporate structures. But what I was looking at right now was incredibly raw and devastatingly personal. "They told me my father was broke," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "DeAndre stood in that conference room today and swore that Oakwood Holdings was a bankrupt company drowning in toxic debt. He claimed he was generously trying to absorb it to save my credit score." I flipped through 3 more notebooks, tracing a massive web of fraudulent transactions. Every single time my father had a lucid day, he had dragged himself to his home office, logged into his accounts, and recorded the theft he was powerless to stop. Uncle Roland leaned closer, pointing a thick finger at a massive withdrawal listed on the final page. "Good Lord, Nia," he gasped. "Is that what I think it is?" I stared at the entry. It was dated just 6 months ago, when my father was already bedridden and completely nonverbal. A wire transfer for $1.2 million. The entire remaining balance of his lifelong commercial real estate portfolio. The money had been violently ripped out of his account and transferred to Oakwood Holdings. But Oakwood Holdings was not a legitimate business. I recognized the routing numbers listed on the attached deposit slip. It was a shell company designed explicitly to funnel money into high-risk, unregulated cryptocurrency wallets. "My father was never broke," I said, my voice trembling with profound grief and terrifying new rage. "He was a multi-millionaire. Valerie and DeAndre systematically bled him completely dry. DeAndre used Oakwood Holdings as a massive vacuum to suck up every penny of my father's wealth to fund his flashy crypto startup scams, while my mother looked the other way. They stole everything. They isolated an incredibly sick, vulnerable man, trapped him in his own home, and methodically robbed him blind while he lay dying. And today they tried to force me to sign a legal waiver that would completely absolve them of federal crimes and permanently bury the evidence forever." I slowly closed the ledger. I looked up at Uncle Roland. He saw the cold, dangerous fire burning brightly in my eyes. The sad little girl they kicked out of the house was completely gone. I was a highly trained corporate financial assassin, and today they had just officially handed me the absolute perfect weapon to destroy their entire fraudulent lives. I barely slept a single hour that night. I had taken my father's handwritten ledgers back to my hotel room, ordered a large pot of black coffee, and spent the entire night building a preliminary spreadsheet on my laptop. I carefully traced every single stolen dollar, cross-referencing his messy notes with the official bank statements. By the time the sun began to rise over the Atlanta skyline, the sheer massive scale of their theft was completely undeniable. I was just stepping out of the shower when the phone on my nightstand rang loudly. It was the front desk concierge. A group of people was waiting for me in the lobby, aggressively demanding to come up to my room. I already knew exactly who it was. I dressed quickly in a sharp, tailored dark gray pantsuit, pulled my hair back into a tight, severe bun, and grabbed my phone. When the elevator doors slid open to the ground floor, I stepped out into the bustling, elegant hotel lobby. There, sitting on the plush velvet sofas near the grand fireplace like an invading hostile army, was my mother Valerie, my sister Tasha, and DeAndre. But they had not come alone. Sitting right in the middle of them, looking deeply concerned and holding a leather-bound Bible, was Pastor Williams, the head of our prominent Atlanta megachurch. My mother had officially deployed her ultimate psychological weapon. She had brought the church directly to my front door. As soon as I approached their seating area, Valerie immediately burst into fresh dramatic tears. She clutched Pastor Williams by his arm, her face buried in a crumpled tissue, putting on an Oscar-worthy performance. "Oh, Nia," she sobbed loudly, her voice trembling perfectly to draw the attention of passing hotel guests. "Thank the Lord you finally came down. I have barely slept a wink praying for your troubled soul. Please tell me you have cast out this awful spirit of rebellion and are ready to do the right thing for your family." Pastor Williams stood up, smoothing the lapels of his expensive tailored suit. He gave me a look of deep, profound disappointment. It was the exact same heavy, judgmental look he used from the pulpit when preaching about wayward, stubborn sinners. "Nia," he said, his voice booming slightly as if trying to project his sermon to the entire hotel lobby. "Your mother came to me early this morning in absolute agony. A family should be united in their grief, not torn apart by worldly greed. Your father was a good, faithful man, and he would be entirely heartbroken to see you holding your family hostage like this." I crossed my arms, keeping my physical distance from the group. "I am not holding anyone hostage, Pastor," I replied calmly, completely ignoring my mother's fake crying. "I simply asked for 3 business days to legally review my father's estate paperwork. That is a standard legal procedure." Tasha scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes and tossing her expensive hair over her shoulder. "3 days to figure out how to steal what little we have left, you mean?" She leaned heavily into DeAndre, wrapping her arms around his bicep, playing the fragile, dependent wife. "DeAndre has worked so incredibly hard to keep this family afloat, Nia. He even stepped up to manage Dad's terrible debt when you refused to help. And now you are trying to ruin my marriage by putting all this horrible, unnecessary financial stress on my husband." Pastor Williams nodded sympathetically at Tasha before turning his heavy gaze back to me. "Nia, the scripture tells us to honor our mother and father. By selfishly dragging out this legal process, you are putting a massive burden on your younger sister's household. But more importantly, you are directly threatening the future of our church community." I narrowed my eyes slightly, my forensic instincts instantly flaring up. "What exactly does my father's estate have to do with the church, pastor?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly flat. Valerie sniffled loudly, dabbing her dry eyes with the tissue. "Do not play dumb with us, Nia. You know exactly how much the new community center means to our congregation. If you do not sign that legal waiver today, DeAndre cannot process the necessary paperwork to finalize the charitable donation your father promised us before he passed away." My mind was instantly spinning, processing their words at lightning speed, analyzing every single syllable for hidden financial implications. DeAndre jumped into the conversation, his voice aggressive but tinged with a very real, very raw layer of genuine panic. "We need to close out Oakwood Holdings right now, Nia. Today. The church is relying on that specific plot of land to break ground next month. If you keep stalling, the entire community center project falls apart and the congregation loses everything. It will be completely your fault." I stared directly at DeAndre. He was sweating profusely again despite the cool air conditioning of the lobby. His jaw was clenched incredibly tight and his leg was bouncing rapidly up and down. In the world of corporate financial investigations, we call this the fatal overshare. Liars always give you way too much specific detail when they are desperately trying to cover their tracks. Just yesterday in his lawyer's office, DeAndre forcefully claimed that Oakwood Holdings was a bankrupt, useless company drowning in toxic high-interest debt. He swore it would ruin my credit score if I touched it. But today, right here in this lobby, he and my mother were confidently telling the pastor that Oakwood Holdings was the absolute key to funding a massive church community center. Bankrupt shell companies do not donate prime real estate to mega churches. Then the final puzzle piece forcefully clicked into place inside my head. I remembered the very last ledger entry I had read in the bank vault with Uncle Roland. My father's $1.2 million commercial real estate portfolio had been rapidly transferred out of his personal name. The ledger explicitly noted the destination: Oakwood Holdings. That specific real estate portfolio included the massive plot of undeveloped land located directly adjacent to Pastor Williams' church, plus a highly lucrative, bustling commercial strip over in the wealthy Buckhead district. Oakwood Holdings was not a fake shell company holding DeAndre's crypto debt. It was the holding company that currently owned millions of dollars in prime, highly sought-after Atlanta real estate. DeAndre had systematically stolen my father's properties, forged the transfer documents, and parked them safely inside Oakwood Holdings. He needed me to sign the waiver of inheritance to completely relinquish my legal claim to that specific company. Once I signed my rights away, he would immediately liquidate the real estate, selling it off to the highest bidder to pay off the massive crypto debts and angry, violent loan sharks he was desperately hiding from. And to guarantee my compliance, he and my mother had maliciously manipulated Pastor Williams and the entire church congregation into pressuring me by promising them a small piece of the land for their community center once the massive sale went through. It was a brilliant, vicious, and entirely evil scam. They were literally weaponizing the name of God and the faith of an entire community to force me to pull the trigger on my own financial execution. I looked at Pastor Williams, who was still staring at me, expecting me to crumble under the heavy weight of his religious authority. "Pastor," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, "let me ask you a very simple question. Did DeAndre show you the actual deed to this land he promised to donate?" Pastor Williams frowned, looking slightly confused by the sudden shift in my questioning. "Well, no," he replied slowly. "DeAndre explained that the title is currently tied up in probate because of your father's passing and that your signature is required to release the charitable assets." I turned my gaze slowly toward DeAndre. His eyes were wide with sudden terrifying realization. He knew that I knew. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sick and hollow. "He is lying to you, Pastor," I said, clearly loudly enough for several people in the lobby to turn their heads. "DeAndre does not own that land. My father never promised it to the church. DeAndre is trying to illegally liquidate stolen assets to cover his own massive financial failures." "How dare you!" Valerie shrieked, dropping the crumpled tissue and completely abandoning her grieving widow act. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly hatred. "You are a lying, spiteful demon. Pastor, do not listen to a single word this ungrateful girl says." I held up my hand, silencing her instantly. The sheer authority in my gesture made even Pastor Williams take a small step back. "I am done listening to this pathetic performance," I announced, grabbing my phone from my pocket. "You thought you could ambush me in public and use the church to extort my signature. You thought I was still the scared little girl you threw out onto the street 10 years ago. You are severely mistaken." I looked dead into my mother's eyes. "I am a forensic accountant, Valerie. I track stolen money for a living. And I promise you I am going to track down every single dime you and DeAndre bled out of my father while he was dying." Tasha opened her mouth to scream at me, but I completely cut her off. "Do not speak to me, Tasha. Go home and start packing your expensive bags. You are going to need a massive head start when the creditors finally catch up with your fraudulent husband." I turned to the concierge desk, signaling the hotel security guard who had been watching the commotion unfold. Please escort these people off the premises, I instructed the guard, my voice echoing with absolute icy control. They are harassing a registered guest. If they refuse to leave, call the Atlanta Police Department. I did not wait to watch the security guard approach them. I did not stay to hear Pastor Williams' shocked gasps or my mother's violent screaming echoing through the lobby. I simply turned on my heel, walked straight back to the elevators, and hit the button for my floor. The doors slid shut, completely cutting off their desperate toxic noise. I had absolutely everything I needed now. It was time to call my corporate team in New York and unleash hell. The moment I stepped back into my hotel room, I threw the deadbolt and engaged the security chain. There was no time for tears and absolutely no room for emotional hesitation. I was no longer a grieving daughter dealing with a family dispute. I was a senior forensic accountant, and my target had just handed me the exact map of his vulnerabilities. I walked straight to the small glass desk near the window, pulled my high-powered corporate laptop from my briefcase, and plugged it into the wall. I connected to my firm's encrypted virtual private network, bypassing the insecure hotel Wi-Fi. Once the secure connection was established, I picked up my phone and dialed the direct emergency line for my investigative team back in New York. It rang barely twice before my lead analyst picked up. "Good morning, Naya," he said, sounding instantly alert. "What kind of fire are we putting out today?" "I need a full tactical financial dive." I told him, my fingers already flying across the keyboard to open multiple secure terminal windows. "I am sending you a limited liability company name and a set of routing numbers. The company is called Oakwood Holdings. It is registered locally here in Georgia, but I suspect it is part of a much larger corporate maze. I need you to pull every single public tax record, property deed, and corporate registration associated with this entity. I want to know who formed it, who funds it, and exactly where the money flows." "Give me 2 minutes," he replied, the sound of rapid typing echoing through the phone line. While he initiated the macro-level search, I began the micro-level tracking. In forensic accounting, we have a cardinal rule: follow the money. People lie, documents can be easily forged, and family members will absolutely betray you. But numbers never lie. Money leaves a permanent digital footprint, and if you know exactly how to look for it, you can reconstruct the entire truth of a crime. I logged into the Fulton County Property Tax Database using my specialized corporate access credentials. I typed in my father's legal name and initiated a historical search of his entire commercial real estate portfolio. The results loaded instantly and my stomach clenched. Just as I suspected, every single prime property my father had spent his entire life acquiring was completely gone. The deeds had all been systematically transferred out of his name. I clicked on the transfer history for the massive plot of land located right next to Pastor Williams' church. The ownership had been officially transferred to Oakwood Holdings exactly 8 months ago. "I have the initial corporate filings for Oakwood Holdings," my analyst announced through the speakerphone. "It is a classic dummy corporation, Nia. It was registered 18 months ago. The listed registered agent is a generic legal service in downtown Atlanta, but the managing member is completely hidden behind another corporate layer. The parent company is called Apex Digital Ventures. Run Apex Digital Ventures." I ordered pulling up a separate window to access the federal corporate registry. He typed furiously. "Apex Digital is registered in Delaware," he confirmed a few seconds later. "Of course it is," I muttered, shaking my head at the sheer predictability of the scam. Delaware is the absolute favorite playground for amateur fraudsters and desperate grifters. The state laws allow individuals to create shell companies with near total anonymity, shielding the true owners from public record searches and casual legal scrutiny. DeAndre thought he was being incredibly clever by wrapping his theft in layers of anonymous corporate armor, but he severely underestimated the capabilities of a corporate financial investigator who dismantled offshore tax havens for breakfast. "Tap into the financial crimes database," I instructed my analyst. "Delaware protects you from the public, but nobody is protected from federal banking regulators. Cross-reference Apex Digital Ventures with any associated banking accounts." There was a tense silence on the line for nearly 3 minutes. I used the time to pull the property records for the commercial strip in Buckhead. It followed the exact same pattern. The title had been quietly transferred from my father to Oakwood Holdings and then leveraged for a massive commercial mortgage. DeAndre had literally stolen the property and then taken out a huge loan against its value, effectively cashing out the equity and leaving the property drowning in fresh debt. "I have a hit," my analyst finally said, his voice tight with professional excitement. Apex Digital Ventures has a primary operating account with a regional bank in Miami. The authorized signatory on that specific account is a man named DeAndre Miller. I smiled a cold, humorless smile. "Got you," I whispered. My analyst continued reading the incoming data. "DeAndre Miller is busy, Nia. Apex Digital is just the tip of the spear. He actually has 3 completely separate shell companies registered in Delaware. Besides Apex, he operates Genesis Crypto LLC and NextGen Capital Group. They are all heavily intertwined. Money is bouncing violently between these 3 entities like a chaotic game of ping pong. It looks like a textbook Ponzi scheme. He is moving funds from one shell company to another to create the false illusion of massive corporate revenue. He is using stolen real estate to fund a failing crypto scam," I explained, my eyes scanning the complex web of financial transfers appearing on my screen. "He took my father's properties, took out massive loans against them, and is currently bleeding that cash into these Delaware shell companies to pay off his angry investors." "Well, the well is officially running completely dry," my analyst observed. "Genesis Crypto LLC currently has a negative balance and multiple pending lawsuits from investors claiming massive fraud. NextGen Capital has barely $2,000 left. The only account keeping this entire house of cards from collapsing is Apex Digital Ventures, and that account received a massive injection of cash exactly 6 months ago." How much, I asked, pulling up the handwritten ledger I had scanned into my system. $1.2 million, my analyst confirmed. It was a direct wire transfer. It came straight from a personal savings account registered to your father. The transfer note simply says corporate investment. I pulled up the exact date of that specific wire transfer on my screen. It was December 12th. My breath caught sharply in my throat as my eyes locked onto that specific date. I opened a new folder on my desktop containing the medical files Uncle Roland had given me from the hospital. I quickly scrolled through the hundreds of pages of doctor notes, daily nursing logs, and specialized treatment plans until I found the records for December. My forensic accounting training had taught me to always verify the physical capability of the individual initiating a massive financial transaction. In cases of suspected elder abuse, the timing of the money movement is the most critical piece of evidence. I looked at the hospital records for December 12th. Then I looked at the bank transfer date. I looked back at the hospital records verifying the signatures of the attending physicians and the timestamps on the daily medical charts. A wave of absolute chilling horror washed over me, followed instantly by a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. My analyst heard my sharp intake of breath over the phone. "Nia, what is it?" he asked, his tone shifting from analytical to deeply concerned. "What did you just find?" "They did not just coerce him," I said, my voice trembling slightly before hardening into solid steel. "They did not just trick him into signing a bad contract during a moment of mental weakness." "What do you mean?" my analyst asked. "I mean, the transfer of the $1.2 million happened on December 12th. I explained, reading directly from the official hospital logs. "According to these medical records, my father suffered a massive secondary stroke on December 10th. By the morning of December 11th, he was completely non-responsive. He was immediately transported to the intensive care unit. On December 12th, the exact day this massive wire transfer was officially initiated, my father was fully incapacitated. He was in a medically induced coma and relying entirely on a ventilator to breathe." Silence fell heavily over the encrypted phone line. Even my seasoned corporate analyst who dealt with white-collar criminals every single day was momentarily stunned by the sheer calculated evil of the act. "He was in a coma," my analyst repeated softly. "Yes," I confirmed, staring at the damning evidence glowing brightly on my laptop screen. "He was physically completely incapable of authorizing a bank transfer. He could not speak, He could not hold a pen, and he certainly could not authorize a seven-figure wire transfer to a Delaware shell company. Which means my analyst said, finishing the thought, someone else actively impersonated him. Exactly, I said. DeAndre and Valerie did not just quietly mismanage his estate. They actively forged the signature of a comatose man. They logged into his secure banking portal, likely using a device they stole from his home office, and illegally authorized the transfer of his entire life savings while he was lying unconscious in a hospital bed, completely fighting for his life. That is not just civil fraud, Naya, my analyst warned, his voice turning deadly serious. That is wire fraud. That is aggravated identity theft. That is severe elder financial abuse. You are looking at multiple federal felonies. If you take this to the authorities, the Federal Bureau of Investigation will absolutely dismantle their entire lives. They are looking at a minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. I leaned back in my chair, looking at the names of my mother and my brother-in-law floating on the digital documents. I thought about the sheer arrogance Valerie displayed in the lobby, telling the pastor I was a demon. I thought about Tasha acting like a fragile victim while spending stolen money on designer clothes. And I thought about DeAndre aggressively pinning my father's letter to the table, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me into silence. Package all of it. I commanded, my voice cold and absolute. I want the property deeds, the Delaware Shell Company, registrations, the bank routing numbers, and the exact timestamps of that specific wire transfer. I want everything cross-referenced with these hospital records and bound into a certified forensic audit report. Send the physical copies to me here in Atlanta via overnight secure courier. You got it, Nia, my analyst said, already typing rapidly to compile the massive data drop. What are you going to do next? I am going to go to church, I replied, closing the medical file. They wanted a public family meeting this Sunday to force me to sign their fraudulent papers. I am going to give them exactly what they asked for. I ended the call and closed my laptop. The storm outside my hotel window was finally breaking, letting a single ray of cold afternoon sunlight pierce through the dark clouds. The investigation was officially complete. The invisible weapons were locked, loaded, and entirely in my possession. My toxic family had spent the last 10 years digging a massive financial grave, and this Sunday I was going to push them all straight in. I sat alone in the quiet hotel room, the adrenaline from my phone call with my analyst still humming fiercely through my veins. The federal crimes involving my father were completely secured, bound for a certified forensic report being shipped overnight from New York. But as a professional corporate investigator, I knew that to truly dismantle a hostile target, you cannot just cut off the head of the snake. You have to expose every single lie they use to build their false reality. My mother provided the religious cover, but DeAndre and Tasha provided the visual illusion of massive success. I opened a new secure tab on my browser and decided to take a very close look at the golden child and her supposedly brilliant husband. Tasha had spent the entire morning playing the helpless victim, claiming DeAndre was single-handedly keeping our family afloat. I wanted to see exactly what kind of ship he was actively sailing. I logged into the Georgia State Civil Court database and typed in DeAndre Miller. The search icon spun for a fraction of a second before the screen violently populated with active litigation records. There was not just one lawsuit. There were 7 distinct active cases. The plaintiffs were a diverse mix of independent investors, former business partners, and minor venture capital firms. I opened the most recent filing, a massive civil complaint registered just 4 weeks ago. A group of wealthy local Atlanta investors was suing DeAndre for $2.5 million, alleging gross mismanagement of funds and blatant securities fraud. According to the dense court documents, DeAndre had lured them into funding a revolutionary new cryptocurrency trading algorithm. Instead of investing the capital into the market, he had transferred their money into a private offshore account and used it to entirely fund his personal luxury lifestyle. The legal walls were completely closing in on him. He was a cornered animal facing imminent financial ruin and massive civil penalties. That was exactly why he was so incredibly desperate to force me to sign away Oakwood Holdings. He desperately needed my father's commercial real estate portfolio to pay off the furious investors before they bypassed the civil court system and took their evidence directly to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. But what about Tasha? She was always the very first person to brag about her luxurious life, her custom-built house, and her endless collection of high-end designer bags. She loved making me feel incredibly inadequate because I chose a quiet corporate life in New York instead of aggressively flashing my wealth on social media. I pulled up the property tax records for Fulton County, searching specifically for the massive McMansion they lived in over in the wealthy, affluent suburb of Alpharetta. The county system immediately flagged the property with a bright red digital banner. Notice of default. I clicked the secure link to view the associated legal documents. The massive house was in active legal foreclosure. Tasha and DeAndre had not paid their incredibly high monthly mortgage in over 8 full months. The bank had already filed the necessary paperwork to officially seize the property and sell it at auction. They were legally scheduled to be forcibly evicted by the county sheriff in exactly 2 weeks. I stared at the bright glowing screen, feeling a deep dark sense of absolute vindication. Their entire existence was a carefully constructed pathetic lie. I ran a quick search on their personal vehicles through the state database. Tasha drove a brand new Mercedes G-Wagon, a massive luxury vehicle she constantly featured on her social media feed, posing in front of it with expensive coffee and oversized designer sunglasses. The database revealed the car was not owned at all. It was heavily leased under one of DeAndre's failing shell companies, and the leasing agency had already issued a formal repossession order due to 90 days of complete non-payment. The repo men were literally actively hunting for her car, while she was sitting in my hotel lobby wearing Chanel and crying about my supposed selfishness. It was almost comical how hard they were trying to maintain their absolute illusion of extreme wealth, while their financial house was actively burning to the ground. Every single designer bag, every luxury vacation, and every fancy dinner was paid for with either stolen investor money or my dying father's violently drained bank accounts. Tasha was not a wealthy, successful socialite. She was a glorified accomplice to a massive federal crime living entirely on borrowed time and stolen equity. Her entire life was a fragile glass house built on top of a massive sinkhole of debt. Just as I was saving the official foreclosure documents to my secure encrypted desktop folder, my cell phone buzzed sharply against the glass desk. I glanced down at the screen. It was a long text message from Tasha. I unlocked the phone and read her message. It was a massive paragraph dripping with her usual toxic blend of intense condescension and fake sisterly concern. Nia, I really hope you have calmed down since your little embarrassing outburst in the lobby today. Mom is incredibly stressed out, and her blood pressure is dangerously high, entirely because of you. DeAndre is trying his absolute best to fix the massive mess Dad left behind, and you are just making it impossible for everyone to heal. Please be a good sister for once in your life and stop being so horribly bitter. We are willing to completely forgive your awful behavior if you just show up to church on Sunday and sign the paperwork. Do not ruin my life because you are jealous of what I have built. Love you. I read the message twice. The sheer blinding audacity of her words was genuinely breathtaking. She was sitting inside a massive house she legally no longer owned, waiting for a luxury car that was about to be towed, demanding that I hand over millions of dollars of stolen real estate so she could successfully continue playing pretend. She wanted me to be a good, compliant sister, while she actively participated in robbing our father blind, while he lay completely helpless on a ventilator. Normally, a manipulative message exactly like that would have sent me into a terrible spiral of defensive anger. 10 years ago, I would have frantically written back a massive emotional paragraph desperately trying to defend my character and logically explain my side of the story. I would have begged her to see the truth. But today, sitting in that quiet hotel room, I felt absolutely nothing but cold, sharp professional precision. I did not type out a long, angry, emotional response. I did not call her phone to scream at her. Instead, I turned my absolute attention back to my laptop screen. I opened the official bank foreclosure document, the one carrying the stark red official stamp from the Fulton County Court, ordering the immediate legal seizure of her Alpharetta mansion. I used my computer software to capture a crystal clear, high resolution image of the official eviction date. I made absolutely sure her full legal name, DeAndre's name, and the exact property address were perfectly visible in the cropped image. I sent the image to my phone, then I attached the screenshot directly to our text conversation. I did not add a single word of text to the message. I offered no explanation, no empty threats, and no angry remarks. I just pressed send and watched the small progress bar shoot quickly across the top of my screen until the image was officially delivered to her phone. I set my phone face up on the glass desk and watched the screen closely. Underneath the photo, I sent the small gray typing bubble, immediately appeared, indicating Tasha was drafting a rapid response. She was probably gearing up to send another deeply toxic paragraph full of insults and religious guilt. But then exactly 3 seconds later, the typing bubble abruptly vanished. I waited 1 minute, then 5 minutes, then 10 full minutes. The phone remained completely silent, and the screen remained entirely dark. Tasha went absolutely dead silent. The psychological impact of that single simple image was infinitely more devastating than 1,000 loud angry words. In one brief, silent second, she realized her perfect, flawless mask had been completely ripped off her face. She realized I was not just being a stubborn, difficult sister, I was actively hunting them. She knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that I had breached their secure financial walls and was looking directly at their dirty, hidden secrets. The grand illusion she had spent years carefully cultivating was utterly shattered, and the crippling absolute fear of public exposure had finally silenced the arrogant golden child. I closed the text message thread and deleted her contact information from my phone entirely. There was no longer any need to communicate with her outside of a formal legal setting. I walked over to the large hotel room window and looked out over the sprawling city of Atlanta. The heavy storm had finally passed, leaving the city streets slick and glowing brightly under the amber streetlights. Tomorrow, the overnight secure courier from New York would deliver the physical bound copies of the comprehensive forensic audit report directly into my hands. My mother and DeAndre wanted a massive public spectacle. They wanted to drag me into the large fellowship hall of Pastor William's church on Sunday morning, surround me with heavily judgmental relatives, and use the immense pressure of the entire congregation to forcefully extract my signature. They honestly thought they had the absolute home court advantage. But they did not understand the basic fundamental rules of the war they had recklessly started. You do not bring cheap guilt trips and religious manipulation to a fight involving federal wire fraud and expert forensic accounting. I spent the rest of the evening meticulously organizing the digital files, categorizing every single piece of evidence by the exact legal statute DeAndre and my mother had violated. I prepared a specific secure file exclusively dedicated to Tasha's fraudulent lifestyle, ready to dismantle her completely if she dared to open her mouth in my presence again. The sheer volume of hard evidence was overwhelming, but I processed it with the cold, complete detachment of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. By the time I finally closed my laptop and crawled into the crisp white hotel bed, my mind was entirely at peace. The trap was perfectly set, the evidence was completely locked down, and the silent absolute panic I had just injected into Tasha's life was only a tiny preview of the absolute devastation coming their way on Sunday morning. The loud, sharp knock on my hotel room door woke me instantly at 7 o'clock the next morning. I quickly pulled on a robe and opened the door to find a bonded, secure courier standing in the hallway holding a heavy, locked Pelican case. I signed the digital manifest, took the heavy case, and carried it directly to the small glass desk near the window. I unlocked it using the specific biometric code my analyst had texted me the night before. Inside the protective foam padding sat 3 massive professionally bound binders containing the complete certified forensic audit report. My phone rang almost immediately. It was my lead analyst calling from our New York corporate headquarters. "You received the package," he stated, his voice completely strictly business. "I am looking at it right now," I replied, flipping open the thickest binder, which was entirely packed with high-resolution color copies of bank wire transfers and property deeds. "Look at Section 4, he instructed, his tone practically vibrating with intense professional excitement. "We kept digging long after you went to sleep, Nia. My team found something else overnight. something that officially elevates this entire situation from a messy state-level civil dispute straight into a massive federal criminal indictment. I quickly flipped to the designated tab. Explain it to me, I said, my eyes scanning the complex flowcharts his team had generated. DeAndre did not just wire money directly from your father's Atlanta bank to his Delaware shell companies, my analyst explained. He routed the stolen funds through a third-party financial clearinghouse located down in Miami before bouncing them back up to a commercial lender in New York to rapidly pay off his failing crypto margins. He actively crossed 3 separate state lines using interstate electronic communications to successfully facilitate a massive financial theft. In the United States judicial system, that specific action immediately triggers Title 18 of the United States Code Section 1343. Wire fraud. I said, a cold, hard smile slowly forming on my lips. Exactly, my analyst confirmed. And because the primary victim was a legally incapacitated senior citizen, the charges are automatically enhanced by the federal courts. Severe elder financial abuse combined directly with interstate wire fraud is an absolute nightmare scenario for any defense attorney. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not just issue fines for this kind of behavior, Nia. They kick down doors at dawn, freeze every single bank account you own, and hand out mandatory minimum federal prison sentences. But believe it or not, that is not even the craziest part of what we uncovered. What could possibly be crazier than my incredibly arrogant brother-in-law facing a decade in federal prison, I asked, staring at the dense columns of intercepted banking data. Look at the final tab located in the back of the third binder, my analyst said. The section clearly labeled prior corporate engagements. I opened the third binder and turned to the very last section. Sitting right there in clear black and white was a copy of a standard corporate retainer agreement from my exact own forensic accounting firm. The document was dated exactly 2 years ago. The client name listed at the top of the official contract was Marcus Vance. I frowned, staring closely at the unfamiliar name. Who on earth is Marcus Vance? I asked. That is exactly what I asked myself last night, my analyst said. The name popped up as an automated conflict of interest flag in our internal system when I initially ran the search on Oakwood Holdings. This Marcus Vance character hired our firm exactly 24 months ago to perform a highly discreet, aggressive asset protection restructuring. But Marcus Vance is an absolute ghost in the system. There is no social security number attached to the physical file, just a prepaid, untraceable burner phone number and a heavily encrypted private email address. So I assigned 2 of our best researchers to dig into the actual physical assets our firm helped this ghost client protect. I scanned the attached documents and my breath suddenly hitched in my throat. The comprehensive asset list attached to the Marcus Vance retainer agreement was a perfect exact match of my father's entire commercial real estate portfolio. The massive undeveloped land next to Pastor Williams' church was listed. The highly lucrative commercial strip in Buckhead was listed. Every single property my father had ever purchased was itemized on that firm document. My father, I whispered, my eyes filling with sudden hot tears that completely blurred my vision. Marcus Vance is my father. Marcus was his middle name, and Vance was his beloved mother's maiden name. He knew, Nia, my analyst said softly, his voice dropping its usual clinical detachment. 2 years ago, when his mind first started slipping and he realized your mother was secretly intercepting all of your mail, he knew he was entirely trapped inside that house. He knew DeAndre and Valerie were actively circling like hungry vultures, just waiting for him to lose his cognitive functions so they could strike. So he quietly took the little cash he had hidden away, and he hired the absolute best corporate forensic accounting firm in the country to build an impenetrable financial fortress around his legacy. He purposefully hired your firm. I traced my father's shaky, familiar signature on the bottom of our firm's official retainer agreement. He could not reach me directly over the phone, and he could not send me a letter without my mother destroying it. So he reached out to my professional world instead. He entirely trusted my colleagues to protect what he had spent a lifetime building. What exactly did our firm do for him? I asked, wiping a single stray tear from my cheek and forcing my voice to remain steady. We executed a flawless, absolute legal masterpiece, my analyst explained proudly. 24 months ago, our senior partners legally transferred Oakwood Holdings and every single real estate property inside of it into an irrevocable trust. Do you understand exactly what that means, Nia? I understood perfectly, and the sheer brilliant magnitude of my father's final strategic move left me completely speechless. An irrevocable trust is an ironclad, impenetrable legal structure. Once an asset is officially placed inside, it cannot be modified, amended, or terminated without the explicit written permission of the named beneficiary. And because the trust is irrevocable, the original owner legally surrenders their active ownership rights, meaning the assets are permanently protected from external creditors, greedy lawsuits, and manipulative relatives. Who is the legally named beneficiary of the trust? I asked, even though my heart already knew the absolute truth. You are my analyst, confirmed firmly. You are the sole legal beneficiary and the exclusive controlling trustee. Your father legally handed you total ownership of Oakwood Holdings 2 entire years ago, which means the fake property deeds DeAndre created last month are completely null and void. Valerie legally owns absolutely nothing. DeAndre aggressively pledged commercial real estate to his angry crypto investors that he never actually legally possessed. They tried to steal from an empty vault, Nia. The cash they withdrew from his personal savings account was unfortunately real, but the massive real estate empire they tried to leverage is entirely legally untouchable. A massive wave of profound, deep respect for my father washed over my entire body. He had completely outsmarted them all. While Valerie and DeAndre were busy arrogantly patting themselves on the back for successfully isolating a sick old man, he had quietly moved the entire chessboard, locking his immense wealth behind a federal legal firewall that they could never, ever breach. The intimidating legal waiver they were so desperately trying to force me to sign in Atlanta was completely useless paper. Even if I signed it under extreme duress, the pre-existing irrevocable trust would legally block them from ever liquidating a single blade of grass. Thank you, I told my analyst, my voice thick with intense emotion and absolute gratitude. Send the digital copies of the trust documents directly to my secure inbox right now. I am going to need them this weekend. Are you taking all of this straight to the Federal Bureau of Investigation? He asked. Eventually, yes, I replied, closing the heavy binders and resting my hands flat against the cool leather covers. But first, I have a highly anticipated family meeting to attend. I hung up the phone and immediately dialed Mr. Sterling, the seasoned estate lawyer who had overseen the disastrous meeting earlier in the week. He answered on the second ring. Good morning, Nia, he said, his tone entirely neutral and professional. I assume you have had adequate time to review the waiver of inheritance your brother-in-law provided. I have reviewed absolutely everything, Mr. Sterling, I said, projecting my most authoritative, unshakable corporate voice. I want you to officially contact my mother and DeAndre today. Tell them I have thoroughly considered their deeply passionate arguments regarding the church community center and the terrible debt allegedly burdening the estate. Tell them I am completely ready to resolve this entire matter once and for all. Are you saying you are actually going to sign the document? Mr. Sterling asked, sounding mildly surprised by my apparent sudden surrender. I am saying I am ready to finalize the required paperwork in front of the entire family, I corrected him smoothly. My mother wants a massive, dramatic public spectacle. She wants to do this at the church on Sunday morning, surrounded by the entire congregation and all of our relatives, to ensure I comply. Please inform her that I agree to her specific terms. I will be at the church fellowship hall immediately following the Sunday morning service. I will bring my favorite pen and they need to bring the waiver. I will convey your exact message, Mr. Sterling said. Shall I be present for this meeting? I absolutely insist on it, I replied coldly. In fact, Mr. Sterling, I highly recommend you clear your entire afternoon schedule. You are going to witness a very complex, unprecedented legal unraveling. After ending the call with the lawyer, I immediately dialed Uncle Roland. He picked up right away, the sound of a sports game playing softly in the background. Uncle Roland, I said, skipping any polite introductions. Put on your absolute best Sunday suit this weekend. We are going to church. They are going to try to publicly break you, Naya, he warned, his voice heavy with genuine protective concern. Valerie has been calling every single aunt and uncle, manipulating the entire narrative all week long. She is actively telling everyone you are coming to steal the church land and ruin your sister's marriage. Let her talk, I said, feeling a profound sense of icy calm settling deep into my bones. Let her gather the entire congregation. Let DeAndre strut around the room in his tight, expensive suit, believing he has officially won the war. They desperately want a large audience to witness my absolute surrender. I am simply going to use that exact same audience to witness their total absolute destruction. I spent the remainder of Friday and the entire day Saturday completely isolated inside my hotel room. I did not respond to any of the angry text messages flooding my phone from various misinformed cousins. I completely ignored a highly aggressive, guilt-tripping voicemail from Pastor Williams, reminding me of my spiritual obligations to the family. I meticulously organized my large leather briefcase, placing the certified forensic audit report, the handwritten bank ledgers, the Delaware Shell Company records, and the irrevocable trust documents into precise chronological order for maximum dramatic impact. I was no longer just Nia, the estranged, unwanted daughter. I was the legally appointed trustee of my father's formidable legacy, and I was bringing the full, uncompromising weight of the federal government straight to their Sunday service. The trap was perfectly, completely set, and the wolves were eagerly waiting in their beautiful Sunday hats, entirely unaware that they were about to step directly into a massive, inescapable steel snare. Sunday morning arrived with a bright, oppressive Georgia heat baking the pavement outside my hotel. Uncle Roland picked me up right on time, his rusted truck standing out sharply among the pristine luxury vehicles, slowly filling the massive parking lot of Pastor Williams' megachurch. I wore a tailored black suit, sharply cut and entirely strictly business. I carried my heavy leather briefcase in my right hand, gripping the handle with the absolute certainty of an executioner carrying a sharpened axe. Uncle Roland walked quietly beside me, wearing a crisp dark navy suit he had clearly preserved for special occasions. We did not exchange any nervous chatter. We both knew exactly what we were walking into. The moment we stepped through the massive double doors of the sanctuary, the vibrant, undeniable energy of the African American church experience washed over us. The mass choir was already swaying in the choir stand, their powerful voices harmonizing perfectly over the deep vibrating hum of a Hammond organ and the sharp driving beat of the drums. Ushers wearing immaculate white gloves and sharp black suits expertly guided latecomers down the aisles. The air smelled of expensive perfume peppermints and the faint lingering scent of floor wax. All across the crowded pews, the seasoned church mothers sat in their designated sections, wearing a spectacular array of elaborate Sunday hats, featuring wide brims, delicate netting, and massive silk flowers. I scanned the front rows and immediately spotted my target. Valerie was sitting dead center in the very first pew, occupying the absolute seat of honor. Her outfit was a masterful, flawless display of performative mourning. She wore a sophisticated, expensive black dress, complete with a wide-brimmed black hat that perfectly framed her face. Every few minutes she would gently dab at her completely dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, soaking up the sympathetic murmurs and comforting pats on the shoulder from the church elders passing by. She was playing the brave, grieving widow to absolute perfection, leveraging her profound loss to solidify her supreme social status within the congregation. Sitting directly next to her was Tasha, wearing a designer dress that cost more than most people in the room made in a month. She kept her head resting gently on DeAndre's shoulder, playing the exhausted, emotionally drained daughter. DeAndre sat rigidly upright in a tight, tailored gray suit. He constantly checked his heavy gold watch and nervously adjusted his expensive silk tie. To the untrained eye, he looked like a strong, supportive husband. To a forensic accountant, he looked exactly like a desperate, cornered fraudster, silently counting down the minutes until he could finalize his massive financial escape. Uncle Roland and I quietly took our seats in the very back row of the sanctuary, completely unnoticed by the front pews. We sat through the soaring musical selections and the passionate prayers. Then Pastor Williams approached the heavy wooden podium to deliver his Sunday sermon. Within exactly 2 minutes, It became blatantly obvious that my mother had heavily influenced his message. Pastor Williams paced across the carpeted stage, his booming voice echoing through the state of the art sound system. He preached a highly targeted sermon entirely focused on the biblical themes of family unity, honoring your parents, and the devastating spiritual consequences of worldly greed. He spoke passionately about prodigal children who stray from the righteous path and the absolute necessity of making financial sacrifices to build up the house of the Lord. The congregation responded with enthusiastic shouts of Amen, and Lord have mercy, completely unaware that they were actively participating in a highly coordinated psychological pressure campaign designed exclusively to extort my signature. I sat there in the back row feeling absolutely nothing but cold, analytical detachment. They were using the sacred space of a sanctuary to run a criminal confidence game. When the final benediction was given, the choir launched into an upbeat recessional hymn, and the massive congregation began to slowly file out into the aisles. Valerie stood up from her front row seat, turned around, and immediately locked eyes with me across the sea of people. A brief, smug smile flashed across her face before she quickly masked it with a look of pious solemnity. She gave me a short, commanding nod, gesturing toward the double doors leading to the church fellowship hall. The time had officially come. Uncle Roland placed a heavy, steady hand on my shoulder, giving me a silent nod of solidarity. We walked together through the crowded foyer, navigating past families eagerly discussing their upcoming Sunday dinner plans. The warm, comforting smell of fried chicken macaroni and cheese and sweet pound cake drifted heavily through the air from the main kitchen. But we were not headed toward the joyful communal dining area. We were directed by an usher into a private, secluded conference room located at the very back of the fellowship hall. I pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The room was aggressively illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights, completely stripping away the warm spiritual atmosphere of the sanctuary. A long rectangular folding table dominated the center of the space. Sitting around that table exactly like a hostile jury ready to deliver a guilty verdict were the exact same 15 relatives from Mr. Sterling's law office. My aunts, uncles, and cousins glared at me with undisguised contempt. Standing at the head of the table was Pastor Williams, flanked tightly by 3 senior church elders who all wore expressions of heavy moral authority. Mr. Sterling, the seasoned estate lawyer, sat quietly in the corner, resting his hands on his briefcase, his face completely neutral and entirely unreadable. Valerie stood at the opposite end of the long table with Tasha and DeAndre hovering closely behind her. The absolute second the heavy door clicked shut behind Uncle Roland, the room fell into a thick, suffocating silence. Valerie took a step forward, folding her hands gracefully in front of her. "Nia," she began, her voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet, fake warmth. "I am so incredibly glad you found it in your heart to attend service today. We have all been praying for your soul all week long. We knew that once you heard the word of God, you would finally come to your senses and do the right thing for this family and for this community." Pastor Williams nodded solemnly, resting his hands on his suit jacket. "We are all here to support you in making this difficult but righteous decision, Nia," he said, his deep voice filling the small room. "Your mother has explained the severe financial burden your father accidentally left behind. By signing these documents today, you are not just saving your sister from ruin, you are actively paving the way for our new community center. It is a true blessing." I did not say a single word. I simply stood at the end of the table, gripping the handle of my briefcase, my face a completely blank, impenetrable mask. My total lack of an emotional response seemed to severely agitate DeAndre. He could not stand the silence. He needed his money, and he needed it right now. DeAndre pushed past my mother and marched aggressively up to the table. He reached inside his designer leather folder and pulled out the crisp white waiver of inheritance. He slammed the document down onto the folding table with so much excessive force that the sound echoed sharply like a gunshot in the quiet room. He pulled his expensive gold pen from his inner jacket pocket, clicked it loudly and forcefully, held it out toward me. "Enough of the quiet act," DeAndre barked, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of artificial dominance. "You told the lawyer you were ready to finalize this. The notary is waiting right outside in the hallway. Pick up the pen, Nia. Sign the paper right now so we can all get on with our lives. and fix the massive mess you refuse to help with. Tasha crossed her arms, smirking confidently from the back of the room. Just sign it and go back to New York, Nia, she sneered. We have real family business to handle here today. The 15 relatives murmured their loud, aggressive agreement, nodding at DeAndre and glaring at me, expecting me to finally crumble under the sheer crushing weight of their collective judgment. They had cornered me in a room, surrounded me with religious figures and family members, and physically presented the document. This was their flawless master plan. I looked at the white legal document lying on the table. Then I looked at the shiny gold pen DeAndre was aggressively shoving toward my hand. I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not launch into a passionate defensive speech about how horribly they had treated me. I simply ignored DeAndre's outstretched hand completely. I lifted my heavy leather briefcase and placed it squarely on top of the folding table right next to their fraudulent legal waiver. The room went entirely still. Every single eye in the room dropped down to the polished leather case. Click! I snapped the left brass latch open. The sharp metallic sound cut clearly through the tense silence. Click! I snapped the right brass latch open. I slowly opened the lid of the briefcase. Inside, resting perfectly organized and entirely undisturbed, were 3 massive, professionally bound 50-page forensic audit reports. The glossy black covers gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. I reached inside and pulled out the first 2 heavy-bound volumes. The sheer physical weight of the documents made a solid, authoritative thud as I rested them briefly on the table. "What is that?" Valerie demanded, her fake sweet voice instantly dropping an octave, replaced by a sharp edge of genuine nervous suspicion. "Nia, what are you doing? Just sign the paper." I picked up the first bound report and walked calmly past DeAndre, completely ignoring his intimidating posture. I stopped directly in front of Pastor Williams. I held the heavy 50-page document out to him. He looked confused, his brow furrowing deeply, but his natural instinct caused him to reach out and take it from my hands. Then I turned and walked back toward the door, handing the second heavy-bound report directly to Uncle Roland. He accepted it with a firm, tight grip, a knowing, dangerous glint shining brightly in his dark eyes. I walked back to my position at the end of the table, leaving the third report resting inside my open briefcase. I finally looked up, meeting DeAndre's panicked eyes, then shifting my gaze directly to my mother's suddenly pale face. The absolute silence in the room was no longer a weapon they were using against me. It was the terrifying, breathless quiet right before a massive explosive detonation. I stared at the shiny gold pen DeAndre was aggressively holding out to me. The entire room held its collective breath, fully expecting me to simply give up, crumble under the massive pressure, and sign my entire legacy away. Instead, I looked right past him, locking my eyes directly onto Pastor Williams. "I cannot sign that waiver, Pastor," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the sterile, fluorescent-lit room. "I cannot legally sign away something my father already locked inside an irrevocable trust exactly 2 years ago." The words hit the small, crowded room like a massive physical shockwave. My mother gasped loudly, clutching the edge of the folding table so hard her manicured knuckles turned completely white. DeAndre instantly froze, his hand still awkwardly suspended in midair, holding the useless, expensive pen. "What are you talking about?" DeAndre stammered, his arrogant, commanding facade cracking right down the middle. "That is a total lie. He died in massive debt. We have all the official paperwork to prove it." I tapped the glossy black cover of the 50-page forensic audit report resting firmly on the table. "You have forged paperwork, DeAndre," I corrected him coldly. 2 years ago, when my father first realized you and Valerie were actively isolating him, he quietly hired my corporate forensic accounting firm in New York. He legally transferred Oakwood Holdings and every single piece of commercial real estate he ever owned into a highly protected federal trust. I am the sole named beneficiary and the exclusive controlling trustee. You legally own absolutely nothing, and you never did. Valerie let out a high-pitched, strangled sound, grabbing her chest as if she had just been physically struck. "That is entirely impossible," she cried out, her eyes darting wildly around the room, searching for anyone to agree with her. He did not know how to do that. He was sick. He was terribly confused. He was confused at the very end. Yes, I agreed, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the head of the table. But before the dementia completely took him, he meticulously documented every single time you stole from him. I opened my briefcase again and pulled out the faded spiral-bound ledger, displaying my father's shaky handwritten notes, holding it up for everyone to clearly see. He tracked everything, Mom, every single stolen dollar. And when he could no longer write you, and DeAndre decided to completely empty his personal savings. Before DeAndre could even open his mouth to scream his denial, I flipped open my copy of the bound audit report. Let us talk about December 12th, I announced, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. On December 12th, my father was lying in the intensive care unit in a medically induced coma, breathing exclusively through a hospital ventilator. Yet somehow, on that exact same day, a massive wire transfer for $1.2 million was miraculously authorized from his personal savings account. I turned directly to DeAndre, who was suddenly sweating so profusely it was visibly soaking entirely through his crisp, expensive shirt collar. You routed that stolen money through 3 separate shell companies in Delaware, DeAndre, I said, reading directly from the financial flowchart. Apex Digital Ventures, Genesis Crypto LLC, NextGen Capital Group. And when your domestic accounts started getting rapidly flagged by the angry investors you were actively defrauding, you aggressively bounced the remaining stolen funds straight offshore. I read the numbers aloud clearly and deliberately. Routing number 04927, Cayman Islands offshore depository account, ending in 884. The collective gasp from the 15 relatives and the senior church elders was utterly deafening. The specific mention of a Cayman Islands offshore account completely shattered the carefully crafted illusion of a family struggling with inherited debt. They all knew exactly what offshore accounts meant. It meant premeditated, calculated theft. Shut your mouth! DeAndre roared, his face turning a dark, violent shade of purple. He violently threw the gold pen across the room where it shattered loudly against the cinderblock wall. You are making all of this up. You illegally hacked into my private business accounts. I will sue you for everything you are worth. I will completely destroy your life. He lunged forward forcefully, knocking over a metal folding chair, his massive hands curling into tight, heavy fists. He fully intended to physically grab me, to rip the damning documents out of my hands, and intimidate me into absolute silence, just like he always did to Tasha. But he completely miscalculated exactly who was in the room and what I had prepared for. Before DeAndre could even take 2 full steps, Uncle Roland was already moving. He stepped squarely in front of me, planting his heavy work boots firmly onto the linoleum floor, forming an impenetrable human shield. But Uncle Roland did not even have to throw a single punch because he was not standing alone. 2 massive church deacons, men who had known my father for decades and who actively served as the physical security team for Pastor Williams, immediately stepped away from the back wall. They flanked Uncle Roland, creating a solid, terrifying wall of angry, protective men standing directly between me and DeAndre. Do not take another step, son, one of the deacons warned, his voice rumbling with deep, terrifying authority. If you lay a single finger on Marcus Vance's daughter in the house of the Lord, you are going to leave this room in the back of an ambulance. DeAndre slammed on the brakes, his chest heaving heavily as he stared down 3 large men who were fully prepared to drop him straight to the floor. His physical intimidation tactic evaporated instantly, leaving him completely exposed and utterly powerless. He took a stumbling step backward, his hands shaking violently, as he realized physical force was no longer an option. Pastor Williams slowly closed the heavy forensic audit report I had handed him. His large hands were visibly shaking. The pastor was a man who spent his entire life reading people and guiding his flock, but right now he was reading the undeniable mathematical proof of a massive, devastating crime committed right under his nose. He looked up slowly, turning his heavy, furious gaze directly onto DeAndre. You came to me? Pastor Williams said, his voice vibrating with a cold, righteous anger that made even my mother flinch backward. You came into my private pastoral office, sat on my couch, and wept. You told me you were desperately trying to save your father-in-law's legacy. You promised me that if the church simply helped mediate this family dispute and convinced Nia to sign the waiver, you would generously donate the adjacent commercial land for the youth center. I did, DeAndre stammered desperately, trying to backpedal, raising his hands in a weak, placating gesture. Pastor, I swear to you that was always the exact plan. She is lying about the trust. The land is ours to give. You used the church, Pastor, Williams thundered, stepping forward and pointing a heavy, accusing finger directly at DeAndre's chest. I am looking at the certified bank records right here in this book. You never legally owned that land. You used the sacred name of this congregation to legitimize your fraudulent cryptocurrency loans. You told those angry investors in Atlanta that your massive real estate portfolio was backed by a charitable church partnership. You leveraged the pure faith of this community to steal millions of dollars from innocent people and from a dying man. Tasha let out a loud, dramatic sob, aggressively grabbing DeAndre's arm. Tell them it is not true, DeAndre, she cried loudly, her fake victim persona finally slipping into genuine, absolute panic. Tell them you have the money in the Cayman accounts. Tell them we are not going to lose the house. DeAndre roughly snatched his arm away from his wife, shoving her back slightly. Shut up, Tasha, he hissed through his teeth, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit door. Just shut your mouth before you make this even worse. His wealthy, brilliant businessman facade was entirely, utterly destroyed. In front of the pastor, the church elders, and the very relatives who had spent years worshiping the ground he walked on, DeAndre was officially exposed as nothing but a cheap, desperate thief. The 15 family members who had spent the entire morning glaring at me were now staring at DeAndre with expressions of pure, absolute disgust. Aunts who had previously praised his immense generosity were now whispering furiously to each other, completely horrified that they had been maliciously manipulated into participating in the financial abuse of their dying brother. Several of the aunts who had loudly demanded I sign the waiver just moments before were now openly weeping, realizing the profound depth of my father's silent suffering. They looked at the hospital records copied in the audit report, passing the pages among themselves with shaking hands. Oh my God, one of my father's sisters whispered, covering her face. He was in a coma. They robbed him while he was in a coma. My mother Valerie stood completely frozen. Her hands were covering her mouth and her eyes were wide with a terror I had never seen her display before. She had always been the absolute master of controlling the narrative, spinning lies into truth, and using her religious standing to shield her from any accountability. But the 50-page document resting on the table was a wall of absolute truth she could not climb over. You are going to federal prison. DeAndre, I said, my voice perfectly calm, cutting through the chaotic murmurs of the room. The moment I walk out of this church, I am handing this entire unredacted file over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They already know about the wire fraud, they already know about the forged signatures, and they absolutely know about the $1.2 million you stole while my father was actively suffocating on a ventilator. DeAndre looked around the room, his eyes wild and completely devoid of his former arrogance. He looked at the deacons blocking his path, he looked at the furious pastor, and he looked at the relatives who were now physically backing away from him as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease. He realized in that exact moment that there was no smooth talking his way out of this room. There was no clever lie that could erase the routing numbers I had just read aloud. I am leaving, he announced, his voice cracking terribly. He grabbed his designer folder off the table, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. You people are crazy. I am calling my lawyers. He practically ran toward the heavy wooden door, shoving past two of my stunned cousins. He threw the door open and bolted down the hallway, disappearing from sight, completely abandoning Tasha, who was left standing in the middle of the room, openly sobbing into her hands. The ultimate confrontation with the golden child's husband was officially over. I had systematically dismantled his entire life in under 10 minutes without ever raising my voice or shedding a single tear. The intense, heavy shame in the room was palpable, shifting entirely away from me and settling squarely onto the shoulders of the people who had blindly enabled the abuse. I stood tall, holding my ground, feeling a massive weight lifting off my chest. The truth was finally completely out in the open. The darkness they had used to hide their crimes was entirely eradicated by the harsh, unforgiving light of forensic evidence. DeAndre's destruction was absolute and irreversible, but the final reckoning with the church matriarch was about to begin. As the heavy wooden door slammed shut behind DeAndre, the room remained locked in a stunned, terrifying silence. Tasha stood completely alone at the end of the folding table, her chest heaving as she stared at the empty doorway. The realization that her husband had just abandoned her to face the absolute wrath of a federal investigation finally sank in. But instead of showing any remorse or humility, the Golden Child did exactly what she had been trained to do her entire life. She aggressively played the victim. She spun around to face me, her perfectly manicured hands curling into fists, her face twisting into a mask of pure, ugly rage. "You planned this!" Tasha shrieked, her voice echoing sharply against the cinderblock walls. "You came down here specifically to destroy my marriage because you are so incredibly jealous of me. You have always been jealous of my life, Nia. You could never stand the fact that Dad loved me more, that I had a beautiful house and a successful husband while you were miserable and alone in New York. You just had to completely ruin my family to make yourself feel better." I watched her completely unravel, feeling no pity whatsoever. I reached into my open leather briefcase and bypassed the thick forensic audit reports. Instead, I pulled out a single thin manila folder. I had prepared this specific file entirely for her. "I am not jealous of you, Tasha," I said, my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any emotion. "I am completely embarrassed for you." I opened the manila folder and pulled out the crisp legal documents I had printed directly from the Fulton County Civil Court database. I placed them flat on the table and slowly slid them across the polished wood directly toward her. Tasha glared at the papers, refusing to pick them up, but her eyes darted downward, reading the bold red text stamped across the top of the first page. "Your entire life is a heavily subsidized fantasy." "Tasha," I stated clearly, ensuring every single relative in the room could hear the absolute truth. "You do not have a successful husband. You have a desperate criminal who funded your luxury lifestyle with stolen investor capital and our dying father's drained savings account. And now the money is completely gone." "That is a lie," Tasha screamed, stepping back from the table as if the documents were physically burning her. "DeAndre is wealthy. We are fine. You are just a bitter liar." I tapped the top sheet of paper. "This is a formal notice of default," I explained coldly. "You have not paid the mortgage on your massive Alpharetta mansion in 8 full months. The bank has officially seized the property. You are being evicted on Tuesday, Tasha." Tasha shook her head violently, her perfect blonde hair whipping wildly around her face. "No, no, no," she chanted, backing away until she bumped into the wall. "DeAndre said he took care of it. He said he paid the bank." "He lied to you," I continued, relentlessly pulling the second document from the folder and sliding it next to the first. "Just like he lied about your brand new luxury car. Your G-Wagon was repossessed last night. The leasing agency executed a legal recovery order because you are 90 days delinquent on the payments. The tow truck took it straight out of your driveway while you were sleeping." The final shred of Tasha's carefully constructed reality violently collapsed. The arrogant, confident Golden Child who had spent the last decade looking down her nose at me suddenly vanished. Her knees buckled completely, giving out from underneath her. She collapsed heavily into a metal folding chair, burying her face in her hands and sobbing uncontrollably. The loud heaving cries of absolute devastation filled the small room, but not a single aunt or uncle stepped forward to comfort her. The family members who had constantly praised her fabricated success now looked at her with overwhelming pity and deep embarrassment. Seeing her precious Golden Child entirely broken and publicly humiliated was finally enough to snap Valerie out of her frozen state of terror. The church matriarch realized she was rapidly losing complete control of the narrative, the room, and her family. She had to launch a massive counterattack to reclaim her ultimate authority. Valerie stepped forward aggressively, placing herself directly between me and the sobbing Tasha. She threw her shoulders back, lifting her chin high, desperately attempting to summon the formidable religious authority she had wielded like a heavy club her entire life. How dare you, Valerie roared, her voice vibrating with intense, furious indignation. How dare you walk into the house of the Lord and maliciously attack your own sister? You are a wicked, spiteful girl completely filled with the devil. She turned briefly to the pastor and the church elders, spreading her arms wide, appealing directly to their shared faith. "Pastor, look at what she is doing to our family," she cried, her voice breaking perfectly on cue. "She is tearing us apart with these fabricated corporate documents. She is trying to turn my own flesh and blood against me." Valerie turned back to me, her eyes burning with pure dark hatred. "I am your mother," she screamed, stepping forward until she was only a few feet away from me. "I gave you life. I put clothes on your back and fed you when you were nothing. You owe me absolute respect and absolute obedience. How dare you disrespect me in the house of the Lord?" The 15 relatives held their breath. For 32 years, that specific booming voice and that heavy religious guilt had successfully forced everyone in our family into complete submission. Whenever Valerie invoked her sacred title as a mother, nobody ever dared to question her. She expected me to lower my eyes, apologize for my aggressive tone, and quietly back down. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood my ground, looking directly into the dark, angry eyes of the woman who had intentionally made my childhood a complete living hell. "You aren't a mother," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifyingly calm register that cut straight through her theatrical shouting. "You are a warden." Valerie's mouth opened slightly in shock, but I refused to let her speak. "A real mother protects her children." I continued, stepping forward, closing the physical distance between us. "A real mother does not kick her daughter out onto the street in the middle of the night just to protect a failing son-in-law. A real mother does not systematically intercept letters from a loving father to his daughter, intentionally breaking an old man's heart just to maintain absolute control over his bank accounts. You spent your entire life demanding respect from this congregation while secretly operating as a greedy, manipulative parasite behind closed doors. Do not speak to me like that." Valerie hissed, her religious facade finally cracking completely to reveal the vicious, desperate woman hiding underneath. "You know absolutely nothing. You were not here. I know exactly what happened on December 12th. I countered, my words striking her like physical blows. The mention of that specific date made Valerie physically recoil. Her face drained of all remaining color and her hands began to tremble visibly. "I know that DeAndre did not execute this massive financial theft all by himself," I said, raising my voice so the pastor and the church deacons could hear every single damning detail. DeAndre needed physical access to my father's secure banking tokens. He needed someone living inside the house to bypass the two-factor authentication on the financial accounts. He needed you, Mom. You actively facilitated the entire crime. "That is a lie," she whispered, her voice barely audible, shaking with sudden, intense fear. "The forensic audit report is sitting right there on the table," I reminded her, pointing directly at the heavy-bound volume. "The digital footprints are entirely undeniable. The signature you forged on December 12th happened while Dad was lying in a hospital bed, heavily sedated and relying entirely on a mechanical ventilator to breathe. You stole $1.2 million from a comatose man." The heavy, oppressive silence returned to the fellowship hall. The church elders stared at Valerie with absolute open horror. The pastor shook his head slowly, stepping away from her as if her very presence was deeply spiritually offensive to him. "Do you know what the federal judicial system calls that, Mom?" I asked, leaning in closer so she could hear the absolute finality in my voice. "That is not a simple family misunderstanding. That is aggravated identity theft and severe elder financial abuse. That carries a mandatory 10-year federal prison sentence." Valerie stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the folding table. She looked around the room, frantically searching for a single friendly face, for someone to defend her honor or offer a prayer of protection. But the room was completely cold. Her sisters, her brothers, her cousins, they all looked away, refusing to meet her eyes. She had spent decades ruling this family through fear, manipulation, and religious guilt. But in a matter of 20 minutes, I had completely dismantled her entire kingdom, using nothing but cold, hard, undeniable data. "You are going to be completely ruined, Valerie," I told her, stepping back and adjusting my suit jacket. The church is going to permanently strip you of your title. The congregation you spent years showing off to will completely turn their backs on you. And when the federal agents finally show up at your front door, you will have absolutely nothing left to hide behind. No stolen money, no fancy Sunday hats, and absolutely no family. Valerie slowly sank into the chair next to the sobbing Tasha. The formidable, untouchable matriarch was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified, broken old woman staring blankly at the polished linoleum floor. She finally realized the absolute catastrophic magnitude of her actions. The irrevocable trust had protected my father's real estate, but the cash they had brazenly stolen was a massive glowing federal target painted directly on her back. I turned away from the two devastated women and looked at Mr. Sterling, the estate lawyer who had been watching the entire absolute destruction in complete silence. The lawyer slowly nodded his head, acknowledging the absolute brilliance of the forensic legal trap I had sprung. I had not just refused to sign the waiver. I had entirely obliterated the people attempting to extort me. The ultimate checkmate was officially complete, and the massive federal fallout was completely unavoidable. I had walked into the lion's den completely unarmed and walked out carrying the absolute ultimate victory. Mr. Sterling stood up from his folding chair in the corner of the room. He calmly buttoned his suit jacket and checked his gold pocket watch. Right on time, he murmured, his voice slicing through the heavy sound of Tasha sobbing. He walked deliberately toward the heavy wooden door that DeAndre had violently thrown open just minutes earlier. Mr. Sterling stepped halfway into the hallway and gave a brief professional nod to someone waiting completely out of our sight. The heavy wooden door swung fully open. DeAndre stumbled backward into the fellowship hall, but he was no longer moving under his own arrogant power. His arms were pulled tightly behind his back, and a pair of heavy steel handcuffs glinted sharply under the harsh fluorescent lights. Standing firmly on either side of him, gripping his expensive suit jacket with absolute uncompromising authority, were two tall men wearing tactical vests over their dress shirts. The bold yellow letters FBI were printed clearly across their chests. The collective gasp from the 15 relatives was so loud it sucked the remaining oxygen right out of the room. Tasha stopped crying for a fraction of a second, her mouth falling open in sheer absolute horror before she let out a blood-curdling scream. "DeAndre!" she shrieked, jumping up from her metal chair. "What are you doing to him? Let him go!" The lead federal agent, a tall, broad-shouldered white man with piercing gray eyes, stepped fully into the room. He held up his silver badge, ensuring everyone in the room saw it clearly. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," he announced, his voice projecting with the practiced volume of law enforcement. "Nobody move. Stay exactly where you are." Absolute chaos instantly erupted inside the fellowship hall. Aunts and uncles scrambled backward, knocking over metal chairs, desperately trying to put as much physical distance as possible between themselves and the federal agents. The three senior church elders instinctively formed a protective circle around Pastor Williams, pulling him toward the far wall to completely separate the church leadership from the active criminal arrest. DeAndre looked completely wild, his eyes darting frantically around the room. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as the agents forced him to stand still. "I was just leaving," he stammered, his voice cracking, pitching up into an embarrassing high whine. "I was going to my car. You have no right to detain me. I demand to speak to my lawyer." "You are formally under arrest for interstate wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and severe elder financial abuse," the lead agent stated, completely ignoring DeAndre's frantic protests. "We have federal warrants to seize all your digital devices, your personal bank accounts, and your Delaware corporate holdings." Tasha lunged forward desperately, trying to reach her husband, but one of the church deacons quickly grabbed her by the waist, physically restraining her. She thrashed against the deacons, screaming hysterically at the federal agents. "You are making a massive mistake," Tasha cried, her voice echoing painfully in the small enclosed space. "He is a successful businessman. My sister is setting us up." She printed fake papers to frame him. The second federal agent, a sharp-looking woman with a severe dark bob, pulled a folded piece of paper from her jacket pocket. "We are not operating on printed papers, Mom," she replied coldly. "We are operating on a sworn federal indictment handed down by a federal grand jury at 8 o'clock on Friday morning. We have been sitting outside this church for 2 hours waiting for the service to end so we could execute the arrest warrant. When DeAndre heard the words federal grand jury, the last remaining drop of fight completely drained out of his body. His knees buckled, and the two agents had to physically hold him up by his arms to keep him from collapsing onto the linoleum floor. He realized they already had all the bank records, the routing numbers, and the Delaware Shell Company registrations. There was absolutely no talking his way out of a federal indictment. Then, true to his cowardly nature, DeAndre immediately turned on his accomplices to save himself. "It was not just me," DeAndre yelled desperately, twisting his head to look directly at my mother. "Do not just arrest me. Look at her. Look at Valerie. She gave me the passwords to the bank accounts. She was the one who logged into the computer while the old man was in a coma. I did not forge the signature, she did. She told me to move the money so Nia could not get a single dime." Valerie let out a piercing, horrified scream, aggressively shaking her head and backing away from him. "You lying snake," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at DeAndre. "I never told you to steal anything. You manipulated me. You said you needed a temporary loan for your business." "I did not transfer the funds alone," DeAndre shouted back, his face red and covered in sweat. "You handed me his security token. You sat right next to me at the kitchen table on December 12th. Tell them, Valerie. Tell the agents you were the mastermind." The lead agent raised his hand sharply, cutting off the screaming match. "We are well aware of the timeline, Mr. Miller," the agent said smoothly. "Our cyber division has already tracked the internet protocol addresses used to execute the transfers. We know exactly which devices were used inside the residential home." He turned his piercing gray eyes directly onto my mother. "Valerie Vance," the agent said, taking a heavy step toward her. "We will need you to step out into the hallway. We have a separate federal warrant for your immediate detention and questioning." Valerie froze, completely paralyzed by the sheer terror of the federal agent addressing her directly. The formidable church matriarch, who had spent decades demanding absolute respect from everyone around her, was suddenly reduced to a trembling, terrified suspect. She looked at the agent, then looked wildly at Pastor Williams. "Pastor, please," Valerie begged, her voice trembling violently. "Please tell them who I am. Tell them I am a good Christian woman. I am a pillar of this church. I would never commit a crime. Please use your influence, Pastor." Pastor Williams looked at Valerie with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. He slowly shook his head, taking another deliberate step backward, completely removing himself from her toxic orbit. "You used the Lord's house to hide your wickedness," Valerie the pastor said, his deep voice ringing with absolute finality. "I cannot save you from the consequences of your own sinful actions. May God have mercy on your deeply troubled soul." The realization that the church was entirely abandoning her finally broke Valerie completely. She spun around, her eyes frantically searching the room until they locked directly onto me. I stood at the end of the long folding table, my arms crossed, watching the entire collapse of her empire with cold, analytical precision. I felt Uncle Roland step up right beside me, his silent, strong presence anchoring me in the chaotic room. Valerie took a sudden, desperate step toward me. Her perfectly styled Sunday hat was knocked askew, and her expensive black dress looked suddenly ridiculous. She threw herself forward, literally dropping to her knees on the hard linoleum floor right in front of me. The 15 relatives gasped in collective shock. The proud, arrogant matriarch was on the floor openly begging. "Nia, please," Valerie cried, grabbing the hem of my black suit jacket with shaking hands. "You have to stop this. You are the trustee. You have the power to fix all of this. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them your father gave us permission to use the money." I looked down at her, completely unmoved by her dramatic display of tears. "You want me to lie to federal agents to cover up your crimes?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm and completely steady. "We are family." Valerie sobbed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "We share the same blood, Nia. You cannot send your own mother to prison. You cannot destroy your sister's life like this. We are blood. Family protects family. You have to forgive me, Nia. You have to show mercy." I stared down at the woman who had intentionally made my childhood an emotional prison. I thought about the pale blue bedroom I was forced to stay in, the endless daily criticisms, the college savings she tried to steal, and the night she kicked me out into the cold. I thought about my father trapped in his own home, his mind slowly fading, desperately, writing secret notes to the daughter he was legally blocked from seeing. I reached down and firmly pried her shaking fingers off my suit jacket. Blood only makes us biologically related, I told her, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet spaces between her loud sobs. Respect, honesty, and protection are what make a family. You stripped away my family 10 years ago when you threw me out on the street. Nia, please, Valerie wailed, reaching for me again. Your father would not want this. Your father loved me. That was the exact moment I delivered the absolute final crushing blow. I stepped back, looking down at her kneeling, pathetic form. Dad wanted nothing to do with me, right? I asked, throwing the exact cruel words she had used in the lawyer's office right back into her face. He hated me for 10 solid years. Is that not what you told everyone in this room, Mom? Valerie choked on a sob, unable to answer, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. No, Mom, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, absolute zero. He did not hate me at all. He loved me enough to trust me with his entire legacy. He did not want to push me away. He wanted to protect me from you. I did not wait for her response. I did not look back at Tasha, who was now screaming as the federal agents officially placed DeAndre under arrest and began reading him his Miranda rights. I did not look at the 15 relatives who were standing in stunned, horrified silence, finally realizing they had aggressively backed the wrong side of the family war. I simply picked up my heavy leather briefcase from the folding table. The brass latches clicked shut with a sharp finality. I turned my back on my mother, leaving her wailing loudly on the hard floor of the fellowship hall. Let us go home, Uncle Roland, I said quietly. Uncle Roland nodded, a deep, profound look of pride shining clearly in his eyes. We walked together straight toward the heavy wooden door, stepping cleanly around the federal agents and out into the bright carpeted foyer of the church. The chaotic sounds of crying, screaming, and federal arrests were immediately muffled as the heavy door swung shut behind us. I walked out of the building, stepping directly into the warm, bright Georgia sunshine, breathing in the fresh, clean air of absolute, total freedom. The flight back to New York was the most peaceful journey I had experienced in my entire adult life. I sat by the window of the airplane, watching the sprawling city of Atlanta slowly disappear beneath the thick white clouds. For 10 years, I had carried the heavy, crushing weight of my family's toxic expectations and malicious lies. Now that weight was completely gone, transferred directly onto the shoulders of the people who actually deserved to carry it. The federal justice system moves incredibly slowly when you are waiting for an investigation to begin, but it moves with terrifying lightning speed. When a certified corporate forensic accountant hands them a perfectly organized, heavily documented silver platter of absolute, undeniable evidence. The aftermath of that explosive Sunday morning at the church fellowship hall did not take years to unfold. It only took exactly 1 month for their entire fraudulent empire to completely collapse into dust. Exactly 4 weeks later, the rapid-fire breakdown of the consequences hit my desk in the form of official legal updates from Mr. Sterling. DeAndre was formally indicted by a federal grand jury on multiple counts of interstate wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and severe elder financial abuse. He had arrogantly assumed he could simply hire a high-powered, expensive defense attorney to expertly smooth-talk his way out of the charges. But DeAndre fundamentally misunderstood how federal financial crimes are prosecuted. The moment the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrested him, they immediately executed a sweeping asset freeze. Every single bank account he managed, every Delaware shell company he registered, and every offshore Cayman Island account he secretly opened was instantly locked down by the federal government. He had absolutely zero access to the stolen funds. Without any legitimate money to pay for a private legal defense, the flashy, arrogant crypto investor was forced to use an overworked public defender. His initial bail hearing was an absolute disaster. The federal prosecutor stood up in court and presented my audit report highlighting the offshore routing numbers and his immediate attempt to flee the church fellowship hall when confronted with the evidence. The federal judge immediately deemed DeAndre an extreme flight risk. Bail was completely denied. The man who used to constantly brag on social media about his custom-tailored suits, his expensive imported watches, and his luxurious lifestyle was currently sitting in a tiny concrete cell in a federal holding facility in downtown Atlanta, wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. He was facing a mandatory minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary, and his trial had not even officially started yet. Tasha experienced an equally devastating but entirely different kind of absolute ruin. The foreclosure documents I had slid across the table at the church were completely accurate. That following Tuesday morning, the Fulton County Sheriff arrived at her massive Alpharetta mansion with a formal eviction order. Tasha was forcibly removed from the property. Because DeAndre's assets were entirely frozen by the federal government, she had absolutely no money to secure another luxury rental. Her massive collection of high-end designer bags, her expensive jewelry, and her custom furniture were all legally seized by furious creditors attempting to recoup their massive financial losses. The ultimate golden child who had spent her entire adult life playing the helpless, fragile victim was suddenly thrust into a harsh, unforgiving reality where nobody was coming to rescue her. Tasha was forced to move into a cramped, poorly maintained two-bedroom apartment in a far less desirable, deeply neglected neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. Without her repossessed luxury vehicle, she had to rely on public transportation. But the most spectacular piece of absolute karma was her new employment situation. To simply afford groceries and keep the lights on in her tiny apartment, Tasha had to get a job. Because she had never bothered to finish college or build a legitimate professional resume, her options were incredibly limited. She was hired as a minimum-wage retail associate at a high-end designer boutique in the wealthy Buckhead shopping district. The sheer poetic justice of her situation was magnificent. She now spent 40 hours a week standing on her feet, folding expensive clothes, and serving the exact same wealthy Atlanta socialites she used to eagerly brag to. Her former friends completely pretended not to know her, looking right past her as she rang up their expensive purchases. The arrogant facade she had worn for a decade was entirely shattered, leaving behind a bitter, exhausted woman folding sweaters for minimum wage. But the absolute hardest and most spectacular fall belonged entirely to my mother. Valerie had always valued her prestigious social standing and her powerful religious authority above absolutely everything else, including her own children. When the federal agents hauled her out of the church foyer that Sunday morning, her pristine reputation was instantly permanently eradicated. Facing the terrifying prospect of dying in a federal prison, Valerie did exactly what she always did when cornered. She turned on the people closest to her to completely save herself. She took a massive plea deal from the federal prosecutors, aggressively throwing DeAndre entirely under the bus. She officially testified that he had manipulated her, but she was forced to plead guilty to lesser federal charges of financial negligence and acting as an accessory to wire fraud. Because of her age and her complete cooperation with the federal prosecutors, she avoided serving active prison time. Instead, the judge handed her a suspended sentence with 5 years of incredibly strict federal probation. But avoiding a concrete cell did not mean she escaped absolute punishment. The federal court ordered massive financial restitution. To pay for her defense attorneys, and the court ordered fines, Valerie had to completely liquidate every single remaining legitimate asset she owned. She was forced to sell her beautiful suburban home, the exact same home she had violently kicked me out of 10 years prior. She moved into a cheap, run-down rental property, completely stripped of her previous wealth. However, her financial bankruptcy was nothing compared to her absolute social death. Following the public spectacle of her arrest, Pastor Williams officially and permanently excommunicated her from the congregation. She was formally banned from stepping foot on the church property ever again. The sprawling network of church mothers, aunts, and community leaders who used to hang on to her every word completely cut her off. When she walked down the aisles of the local grocery store, women she had known for 20 years would deliberately turn their shopping carts around and walk the other way, entirely refusing to make eye contact. She became a complete living ghost in the exact same city she used to rule. She had sacrificed her husband and her daughter for money and status, and she ultimately ended up completely losing both. Exactly 1 month after the explosive confrontation, I was sitting in my spacious New York apartment enjoying a quiet Tuesday evening. My laptop was open on the kitchen island, and I was reviewing the final legal documents transferring a substantial portion of the irrevocable trust funds to Uncle Roland, so he could finally purchase his dream home in the countryside. My cell phone suddenly buzzed on the marble countertop. The caller identification displayed a completely unknown local Atlanta phone number. I knew immediately it was a prepaid burner phone. I answered the call, keeping the phone pressed quietly to my ear without saying a single word. Nia. My mother's voice filtered through the speaker, sounding incredibly small, frail, and desperately tired. Please do not hang up the phone. I know you blocked my normal number, but I had to borrow a phone to reach you. Please just listen to me for 1 minute. I leaned back against the kitchen counter, staring out the large glass window at the glowing New York City skyline. I am listening, I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any lingering emotional attachment. I do not have the rent money this month, Naya, Valerie said, her voice cracking as she began to cry. The lawyers took absolutely everything I had. Tasha is barely making enough to feed herself, and she refuses to speak to me because she blames me for DeAndre going to jail. I am completely alone, Nia. I am going to be evicted on Friday. You control the trust now. You have all of your father's money. Please, Nia. Just send me enough to cover the rent. I'm not asking for a handout, I'm just asking for a small loan. She paused, taking a shaky, desperate breath before deploying the exact same toxic manipulation tactic she had used her entire life. We are family. Nia. Valerie wept loudly into the phone. I am your mother. I gave birth to you. You cannot just leave me out here on the street to completely starve. You have to help me because we are family. I listened to her desperate sobbing, completely unaffected. 10 years ago, a phone call like this would have broken my heart. I would have instantly transferred the money desperately, hoping that saving her would finally earn me the love and validation I had always craved. But forensic accounting teaches you a very valuable lesson about bad investments. You never throw good, legitimate money into a completely fraudulent, bankrupt system. Mom, I said, my voice dropping to a cool, measured, professional tone that instantly silenced her crying. I want you to listen to me very carefully, because this is the absolute last time you will ever hear my voice. She sniffled quietly, holding her breath on the other end of the line. You loved playing the powerful matriarch when you had my father's stolen money backing you up. I told her, the words cutting cleanly through the digital connection. You loved using the concept of family as a weapon to completely control everyone around you. But you fundamentally misunderstand what that word actually means. You think that simply sharing genetics entitles you to a lifetime of my unconditional financial support, regardless of how violently you abuse me? Nia, please, she whispered, begging quietly. DNA makes us relatives, Mom, I said, delivering the absolute final boundary with chilling precision. But respect is what makes a family. You lost the right to call me your daughter the exact night you threw me out into the cold, and the day you robbed my dying father blind. You are a stranger to me now. Do not ever call this number again. I pulled the phone away from my ear, ignoring her sudden frantic screaming entirely. I tapped the red button to completely sever the call. I immediately opened the contact settings and permanently blocked the unknown burner number, ensuring she could never reach through the digital barrier again. I set the phone face down on the cool marble counter, picked up my pen, and signed the final trust document for Uncle Roland. The ultimate audit of my family was officially closed. The debts were entirely paid, the liabilities were completely severed, and the incredibly bright, beautiful future ahead of me was finally fundamentally secure. 6 months later, the oppressive humidity of the Georgia summer had finally broken, giving way to a crisp, beautiful autumn afternoon. I sat comfortably on the wide wraparound wooden porch of a stunning newly constructed farmhouse located just 45 minutes outside of the chaotic Atlanta city limits. The property was incredibly peaceful, completely surrounded by acres of tall, ancient oak trees and gently rolling green hills. I held a cold glass of iced sweet tea in my hand, listening to the gentle rhythmic creaking of the wooden rocking chair next to me. Uncle Roland sat in that chair looking out over the vast expanse of land with an expression of profound, absolute contentment. He looked 10 years younger. The heavy burden of being the family outcast, the invisible weight he had carried on his shoulders for over a decade, had entirely vanished. When the federal dust finally settled and my absolute legal control over the irrevocable trust was completely recognized by the courts, I made my very first official executive decision as the trustee. I used a small portion of the legitimate protected funds generated by Oakwood Holdings to purchase this beautiful property completely outright. I handed the deed directly to Uncle Roland. Glee. It was not a gift of charity. It was a deeply delayed payment for his unwavering loyalty to my father and his quiet, fierce protection of me when I needed it the most. We sat in a comfortable silence, sipping our sweet tea and watching the orange autumn sun slowly dip below the tree line. There were no incoming, frantic phone calls from angry relatives demanding money. There were no sudden ambush visits from manipulative church elders attempting to guilt-trip us. There was no screaming, crying, or any toxic drama. The silence on that porch was not the heavy, terrifying silence of secrets being buried. It was the light, breathable silence of absolute, complete peace. My father spent his entire life working incredibly hard to build his commercial real estate empire. He sacrificed his time and his energy to create generational wealth, hoping to provide a solid foundation for his family. For years, I thought his ultimate failure was allowing Valerie to isolate him and steal that foundation away. I thought he had been completely defeated by her relentless manipulation. But sitting on this porch, looking at the tangible results of his brilliant secret legal maneuvering, I finally understood the sheer magnitude of his love. He did not lose the war. He quietly changed the entire battlefield. He knew that leaving me a standard traditional inheritance would only paint a massive target on my back. If he had simply left me a regular bank account or a standard will, Valerie and DeAndre would have tied me up in endless civil litigation, aggressively draining the estate in probate court while dragging my name through the mud. By utilizing a forensic accounting firm and establishing an impenetrable federal trust, he completely bypassed the standard legal system. He legally stripped them of their weapons before they even realized they were in a fight. I took a slow sip of sweet tea, feeling a profound sense of gratitude wash over me. The money generated by Oakwood Holdings is secure, well invested, and growing steadily, but the financial security is honestly secondary to the emotional freedom it provided. I looked at Uncle Roland, who smiled and raised his glass in a quiet toast to my father. We had survived the fire and we had emerged completely unscathed. The journey from that freezing mahogany-paneled law office in downtown Atlanta to this warm, sunlit porch was the hardest transition of my entire life. I had to completely dismantle the only support system I ever knew, even though that specific system was actively poisoning me. There were moments during the intense federal investigation when I felt an overwhelming sense of profound isolation. But standing firm in my professional expertise and relying heavily on the undeniable mathematical evidence allowed me to push through the paralyzing fear. I learned that true strength is not about tolerating endless abuse just to keep the peace at a holiday dinner table. True strength is looking directly at the people who are intentionally hurting you and deciding that your mental health is infinitely more valuable than their comfort. When you grow up inside a highly toxic environment, you are constantly conditioned to believe that you are the fundamental problem. The manipulators, the narcissists, and the golden children work together in perfect unison to convince you that your boundaries are selfish and your anger is completely unjustified. They use the powerful concept of family loyalty as an invisible chain to keep you bound to their dysfunction. They demand your resources, your time, and your complete emotional submission, while offering absolutely nothing but criticism and betrayal in return. But the truth is a highly destructive force to people who build their entire lives on lies. Exposing their reality requires immense courage, because you have to be willing to lose the illusion of the family you always wanted in order to protect the reality of the peace you truly deserve. Sometimes the greatest inheritance a parent can leave you isn't money. It's the absolute truth and the legal power to sever yourself from your abusers. My father gave me the undeniable truth hidden inside a battered spiral notebook. He gave me the legal power locked inside an irrevocable trust. And with those two incredible tools, I was able to surgically remove the cancer from my life and walk away completely free. I am no longer the scapegoat. I am no longer the outcast. I am a successful woman who fought a massive war against her own blood and won absolute total independence. Have you ever had to expose a family member's perfect facade to protect yourself? Let me know in the comments. And remember, never let anyone weaponize your DNA against you. Hit like, subscribe, and stay ruthless with your boundaries.